Good morning, all. Deb Myhoff with Communitas, the facilitator for the Housing Actions Work Group for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. This is our 13th and final meeting. Really glad you all are here this morning. As folks are still coming in the room, I might just do a little overview of the meeting objectives first, and then we can go to introductions. And let's see here. I'll recap them. So this morning, we are here to review the proposed rules for the draft administrative rules that were published on October 1st, especially related to the compliance pathways for HPS action selection, contextualized housing need assumptions, the Housing Acceleration Program, and the rules of the model code, as well as the draft model code and its current draft. And then we will have a little bit of presentation for each of those items, highlighting some feedback since the last time we met in August and highlighting some of the changes in the draft rules or the model code since you last saw it, and then devoting as much time as possible to getting your feedback on any of those things, and especially ideas for where there might be clarification needed, or things that could just be a little better worded, or et cetera. So, and any other feedback you wish to provide on those. And then we'll spend just a little bit of time closing out the Housing Actions Work Group at the end. And so that's where we are. I think quite a few more people have joined us since we started. So why don't we go to introductions, and then we'll work through the remainder, then we'll work through the agenda from there. Again, my name's Deb Myhoff, facilitating the HOG this morning. Let's start with DLCD and other agency staff if there's others on. And Thea, I'll kick it to you to begin.
Sure, thanks, Deb. Hi, all. Thea Croman, she, her pronouns, and a housing planner with Department of Land Conservation and Development. Really happy to be here with you all on the final HOG meeting at the end of this long stretch, and just feeling a lot of appreciation for all the work that you all have devoted to this. So we'll talk about that more, but I'll pass it now to my colleague, Sean.
Hi folks, Sean Edging, housing planner at the Housing Accountability and Production Office. I'm helping steward along the model code work that's happening as part of this. Yeah, great to be here. I'll pass it over to Celestina.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning, everybody. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, housing planner here at DLCD, and I'm happy to see you all and happy autumn. Maybe over to you, Ethan.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Ethan Stuckmeyer, I manage the housing division at DLCD. Thanks for being here.
And Ingrid?
Good morning, everyone. Ingrid Cordell, Admin Specialist for Housing Division, DLCD. Back to you, Deb.
Thank you. And I think you all know this, but just in case you forgot, Ingrid is the person to connect with if you're having some technical difficulties, and she can help troubleshoot in the background. How about Alan Lazo, Commissioner? Good morning.
Good morning, all. Sorry about that. Had trouble finding the buttons. Happy to be here. Alan Lazo, LCDC Vice Chair, and looking forward to hearing from you all today.
Great, thank you. And then I'll introduce, or they can introduce themselves, a couple of other folks from the consultant team. Madeline?
Good morning, everyone. Madeline Miller from Echo Northwest. Here, most going to be off camera today, taking notes.
Great, thank you. And Kathy?
Hi, I'm Kathy Corliss. I'm a principal with MIG, and we've been helping Sean on the model code drafting.
Great. And Kate?
Morning, Kate Rogers. I'm a senior planner and project manager at MIG, also working on the model code with the team.
Great. Glad you all are here this morning. All right. And let's shift over to HOG members this morning, and we'll start. I'll just run down alphabetically by first name, start with Alexandra. I saw her. Is she still here? There she is. She might have stepped away for a moment. Oh, there you are.
Sorry, folks, having to call Verizon to reset up my work phone this morning. So I may step away here for a moment, but Alexandra Ring, League of Oregon Cities, I'll be right back, I promise.
No worries. Thank you so much, Alexandra. Anne?
Good morning. Anne Catlin, City of Albany Comprehensive Planner, Planning Manager.
And Brianne?
My name Brianne Gale, she, her pronouns, senior planner focusing on housing with City of Bend.
Thank you. Brock?
Everyone, Brock Nation, he, him, Policy Director at Oregon Realtors.
Hi, Brock. Gust?
Good morning, Gus Chachis, rural housing developer in LaGrande, Oregon.
Good morning. John? Did I see John?
Me?
Oh, there he is. Yes, sorry.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry about that. I wasn't sure if I was an official HUG member. So I'm John Miller, Fair Housing Council of Oregon. He, him pronouns. Nice to see everyone.
Thank you for being here. Julia?
Good morning, everyone. Julia Metz, she, her pronouns, and I'm with Sightline and Thousand Friends jointly. Thanks.
Great. Kate? Not Kate, sorry, Karen. Another K name.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Burig. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager at Clackamas County.
Great. And Kathy?
Kathy Wild, Housing Land Advocates, she, her pronouns.
Thank you. Mac?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Mac Cunningham, he, him pronouns, housing developer at Community Partners for Affordable Housing.
Great. Mary Kyle?
Mary Kyle McCurdy, Associate Director at 1000 Friends of Oregon. I use she, her pronouns.
Matt?
Yeah, this is Matt Sears with the Oregon Council on Developmental Disabilities. I'm the Public Policy Director there, and I use he, him pronouns.
Great. Michael?
Michael Anderson with Sightline Institute, him or them, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Rachel?
Hi, everyone. Rachel Bidu here. I'm the Director of Policy and Asset Management at the Network for Oregon Affordable Housing, NOAA. I use she, her pronouns. Good morning.
Good morning. And did I see Ariel come in? It looks like maybe Ariel's dropped again. Okay. And then Madi, I saw you come in. Would you mind introducing yourself if you're there?
Would love to. Good morning, everyone. Mari Valencia Aguilar, share they pronouns, housing planner with the department. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll pick up others along the way. If they join later, I wonder if Ariel might be having technical difficulties, but we'll get them later. All right, so moving along in the agenda, Celestina, have you shared the agenda slide? Or yes, great, thank you. So I mentioned that we'll be covering various topics, and the staff will provide a little bit of presentation at the beginning, and then we'll get into clarification and feedback for each of those. There's a lot to talk about and a limited amount of time, but we'll do our best and try to reserve as much time as possible for you all to provide feedback on these items. Next slide. And just one final reminder about sort of the responsibilities and expectations for our meeting. You will always come prepared, speak at one time, try to help one another balance speaking time. Again, we have limited time together here today and a lot on the table. Listen with respect, and we encourage you to at least discuss topics and try to get resolve sort of, I don't know about resolve difference of opinions, but respect one another's differences of opinions. But make sure you're bringing issues or ideas to the table. That's what we're here for. Next slide. Celestina, are you going to cover this, or Thea, or you want me to roll through this?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. Good morning again, everybody. This is just sort of to review where we are in time in this rulemaking process. We are in the final stretch at this point, as you all probably sense and feel after all of the meetings that we've had. And as we know, today is the last HOG meeting, but there are opportunities for you to continue to submit comments more formally through the public comment period. So that public comment period opened on the 1st with the notice of proposed rulemaking with the Secretary of State, and that will continue through November 7th. Between now and November 7th, we will have a formal public hearing. Well, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, rather, will host a formal public hearing on the rulemaking. So that's a place where you can give verbal or written testimony, and also emailing your comments into the email address on the screen, and we can put it in the chat as well. By November 7th, we'll include those comments in the record. And that's all to say that for today, we have a few unique opportunities in that it's a little bit less formal. So there's the opportunity for a little bit more conversation between HOG members, or really unpacking some ideas in that more conversational way than the remainder of the public comment opportunities. So sort of bringing that to the surface. That being said, at this stage in the rulemaking as well, DLCD staff will largely be listening in. We're here for clarification. If there's a concern about the clarity of what's written in the rule, somebody doesn't quite understand what it is even intending to do, and therefore commentary is challenging, we're here for that. But other than that, we're hoping to reserve the time for to hear from HOG members and see what you all think and what your comments are. So in that way, you'll see us largely as listeners today. And I think with that, our next slide is let me get my clicker correct here, is the racial equity framework for decision making that I can also just roll into, Deb, if that works for you.
Please do. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So speaking of providing your comments and bringing your perspective forward, this is our primary lens through which we have been sorting through all of the topics of the Housing Actions Work Group, the Racial Equity Framework for Decision Making. So especially, we've highlighted it at every meeting, but especially today as we're honing in on specific items that might need refinement, or zooming out to look at how the whole picture and really understand how this program will work together. These are the lenses through which we hope to do that. So I'm going to take a few moments just to put voice to each of these different elements of our racial equity framework for decision making. The first one is historical inequities. Second one is benefits and burdens. We have data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, accountability, restorative justice, decision making, and measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. There's a lot here. Oftentimes we only select one or two elements of the framework to highlight in particular, so that we can really dig in deep. But seeing as it's our last meeting, we really just wanted to put it all on the table. And I would encourage folks to tap into one or two that really are resonating with you, or that you think are particularly meaningful in understanding some of the final decisions in this rulemaking. So I look forward to hearing from you all and your discussion and your comments, and how well you think that these rules that we've all been working through effectively employ this tool, I suppose, because we know that there are areas in the tool like restorative justice that we've discussed, the rules aren't able to fully support, but naming where we're not quite all the way in terms of effectuating our ideals, where there's opportunity to do that, and where maybe things are on the right track. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for the recap of the whole framework. Appreciate that. So let's get going with the topical pieces of the agenda, and we're going to start off. Thea is going to start us off with the contextualized housing need compliance pathway rules, and some refinements that have been made since the last draft. So Thea, take it away.
Sure, thank you. All right, I'll just jump right in, try not to spend too much time here so we can hear from you all. This is sort of an update of our the table that you all saw for version 1. I think you'll note that there are actually no major shifts in sort of where each of these key needs falls on the compliance pathways or the compliance tool spectrum. But I'll talk through some of the feedback in areas that are still kind of open for refinement, or you know, just to give us a reorientation of where we're at. We can move to the next slide, Celestina. So we'll start with rebuttable presumptions, and just as a reminder, rebuttable presumptions provide a baseline for some conclusions in the CHN, but allow cities to demonstrate that an alternative assessment more accurately identifies the housing need in their community. So as we've discussed, the policy content of the rebuttable presumptions in this section, it was really important, a really important principle to divorce the understanding of need from current development patterns. That is sort of a baseline of all of this work in establishing or identifying housing need across the state. You'll remember for housing types, this allocates 40% of the production target for multi-unit need and 20% for middle housing need. And these numbers acknowledge the connection between affordability and type and the need for housing that is really available at those lower price points. So the numbers here are based on a breakdown of housing types that serve 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 80% AMI brackets. Aside from setting a truly arbitrary number, other ideas about how to assess this need statewide are welcome. We are certainly interested in talking about other ways to sort of grasp how, you know, how to apply this type of assumption in a statewide manner. And I'll say we've received feedback on this one that essentially asserts that there can't be a truly standardized assumption of housing type needs statewide in terms of those types. And we agree that there are definitely challenges, and we do know that there's sufficient need in every Oregon jurisdiction to really justify this push to acknowledge and to ultimately plan for more. So that's sort of the basis of this work. Identifying the need statewide does support investment in those policies that address fair housing equally in all regions of the state without shortchanging that need, especially in smaller jurisdictions or in all regions around Oregon. I think the final thing I'll say about this this particular compliance pathway is that clarity and simplicity are sort of the North Star for this rulemaking. And staff and consultants and most commenters seem to really agree that introducing disaggregation across city size or region adds a level of complexity that ultimately increases the analytical burden for cities, which is what we're trying to circumvent. So that said, it's another area where we would definitely be interested in feedback. Is it better to identify a statewide type need, or to attempt to disaggregate by region or city size, creating some levels of nuance? We are interested in your thoughts there, and that trade-off between, you know, the simplicity and predictability and the flexibility and nuance. Again, as a rebuttable presumption, this leaves a path for cities to demonstrate that different need estimates, that a different need estimate better suits the circumstances in that community. We also established in the draft rule a rebuttable presumption for need identification for accessible housing. And this proposal bases the need assumption on ambulatory disability data, which is narrow, but also achieves that goal of disconnecting the understanding of need from the current production framework. And ultimately, it errs closer to those real numbers of Oregonians with disabilities. A subject matter expert group convened to discuss the accessibility related compliance pathways and largely supported this estimate. Although I'll note that at least one commenter pointed out that it would support the estimate to compare data across different sources and align the pathway with whichever is greater. And so the department is working with OHCS currently to consider alternative or additional data sources to establish that need assumption. We can move to the next slide, Celestina. So for safe harbor pathways, local governments may adopt the provisions in section 7 here to reduce the analytical burden and achieve certainty in the methods and conclusions in certain key housing needs. Because age is closely related to the need for adaptable housing, staff recommend that safe harbor that provides sort of a carrot for cities to use the elderly dependency ratio, which we've talked about a little bit before, to establish that need. DLCD received feedback that that data should be augmented with other potential sources. At this point, we haven't really identified a reliable formula beyond that, what's reflected in the draft rules, but there's room for movement there, and definitely open to suggestions about how to measure and calculate that. Section 7 also provides a way to establish conclusions for larger household housing need by relying on an element that's already a required input into the CHN, the housing equity indicators. And for both of these provisions, the safe harbor has cities compare the regional and local data. And to proceed with the safe harbor, they have to take the higher of the two estimates. You can go to the next slide. So staff continue to propose that there are two key needs that fall outside of the rebuttable presumption and safe harbor categories. Locational need, I think we've talked about, is sort of too varied and local by nature and contextually specific to provide a sort of standardized safe harbor. But DLCD, along with our partners and consultants, has developed a statewide tool that's an input into that local analysis. It's now going to be a required input into that analysis. Celestina is going to be digging into that and showing you, giving you kind of a sneak preview of what that tool looks like. And it will be available to cities to help interpret that locational need. For their city specific circumstances. So we'll spend some more time with that in just a minute, and that's actually a very exciting development. Homeownership was elevated this legislative session by HB 2698, which adopted a 65% statewide home ownership goal. This rule points back to that legislation, and last time I incorrectly stated that the rules simply operationalize that goal. But in fact, given that charge to support production, affordability, and choice, and really disrupt those discriminatory and harmful patterns that we've talked about, income bracket disaggregation was added in this rule to support a local focus on lower income home ownership opportunities. DLCD received feedback that this income disaggregation is inappropriate in certain jurisdictions, largely due to current patterns of homeownership and urban development. But the department also received feedback that such differentiation is really critical to support wealth building for housing goals and also, the investment in alternative tenure models. So in version 2, the requirement to align with 2698 at all income brackets remains there. So that is our quick run through of those provisions in the CHN section. And I think we can move to a quick discussion, Deb.
Great, thank you. Let's start, as we always do, with any sort of clarifying questions, anything that Thea just said that raised a question, and then we can get into discussion if not. Yeah, Alexandra.
Not a clarifying question, just discussion.
Okay, all right. Let's just give it another second and make sure. We can also answer clarifications along the way here too. Okay, go right ahead then. Let's get into discussion, please.
Thanks, folks. I appreciate a lot of the changes made between version 1 and version 2. I will say the homeownership goal remains inappropriate, largely because the disaggregation by income. I used to work in homeownership for the state's Housing Finance Agency. There is no organization that can reach 0 to 30% AMI. Like nonprofits included, it's just not possible in our current system. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight long-term to change that system, but it's a deeply inappropriate thing to require of our local jurisdictions who are in no way, financially able to support, the level of financial need that, you would have, or financial support that you would need to reach those income levels. It's incredibly inappropriate to require that of our jurisdictions. We have known, LOC loves homeownership. We're always going to love homeownership. I think when we talk about housing, that's for a lot of our members, one of the top goals is making sure more of our residents get into homeownership. But just like the way this one in particular is implemented, I think is just really out of step with what kind of reality on the ground is. And, I'm not personally of the opinion that 2698 directs DLCD to do anything. It establishes the statewide homeownership goal. That does not necessarily have, nor was it intended to have any impact on ONA. And so while we support there being homeownership, goals in general, I think just at this time, this is not missing the mark, and we don't have enough time to actually get into what a functional homeownership goal within ONA would be right now. I'll also plant the little flag in the sand that minimum standards are not in line with legislative intent and kind of leave that there for now. We've got some substantial concerns that we'll be submitting in writing on that one.
Okay, thank you for flagging your issues. Moving along here, Brock.
Yeah, numerous things, but I'll start with needed housing mix, and I'll touch on homeownership as well. So for the needed housing mix, and actually, sorry, I won't say I touch on homeownership. The two are absolutely in conjunction for the purpose of my comment here. In Oregon, only 6% of housing units that are in buildings of 5 or more units are owned. And you have a 40% requirement for middle housing in your needed housing type mix. It's a rebuttable presumption. It's unclear how strong your demonstration needs to be in order to rebut that, and the department still has to approve. So that's a question that's up in the air. However, assuming that that's what a city goes forward with, right? The goal for 2030 is 65.05%. Even if homeownership rates for 5+ unit buildings doubles, and that's 12%, right? 0.4 times 12, right? That's going to get you 4.8. So, and that's 40% of your housing supply. So if 60% of your housing supply that's either middle housing or other types of housing that's not explicitly multifamily and in that 40% category, if every single one of those units is owned and the multifamily homeownership rate doubles, that would get you to 64.8%, which is not in line with the target. I understand 3746 made some improvements around condos. It is not going to double our rate of multifamily homeownership. You cannot have these two working together in that way and assume that both are going to be accomplished. Additionally, the prescribed housing type mix, and again, I know it's a rebuttable presumption, but in terms of practicality, it's prescribed, is not responsive to what ONA directed, nor is the fact that you openly acknowledge in the commentary for this rule that, one, you don't think an incremental approach meets legislative directive, even though 1970184B says it has to be market responsive. And the recommendations that you got from Eco Northwest, your paid consultant for this work, page 9, financing and market challenges inhibit market rate multi-unit housing production in smaller and more remote communities. Okay, there seems to be a little bit of a problem there. Additionally, applying the metro standard for every city in this state is probably the least appropriate way that you could do this. There's 24-ish cities in metro. That's 10% of all cities in the state. Right, there's a reason that Eco Northwest broke out their recommendation by city size, and it's because you're not seeing the same developments in metro that you're seeing in Molalla. Right? I understand from an equity perspective, right? We want to make sure that all housing types are available everywhere. That does not mean applying uniform standards throughout. I'll leave it there for now. But there's certainly a lot of other things that I'll discuss. It's different points.
All right. Thanks, Brock. A few things to chew on there. Mac.
Yeah, I will make this quick. I don't have necessarily a ton here. Affordable homeownership is not my bread and butter, but I just want to make the plug for I wish that Shannon from Habitat was here today to speak on this. I just want to highlight some of her previous comments from other meetings of highlighting that Habitat has been able to serve between 0 and 30% AMI in certain communities with certain folks. It's not as widespread and not the largest bucket that they serve always, but I just want to re-elevate a comment that she shared in this space. Separate from that, the only thing that kind of also gives me a little bit of some pause related to homeownership goals at that lower level is making sure that households are set up for success as like long-term housing, like life systems need to be updated and maintained, and having the ability to do financially to afford to do so. Have had separate conversations in separate spaces about like what does selling homes for affordable homeownership look like, and making sure that those homes, of course, the conversations then was, okay, we don't want to sell someone at lower levels of affordability a home just for them to have to finance a roof repair in 3 years. Like things like that, just noting that that cost can be incredibly prohibitive and actually counterintuitive to the goal of wanting to have that household build wealth. And so I just want to speak to that difficulty here of wanting to thread that while also being able to increase wealth building opportunities for folks. It's a tricky needle, but I just want to throw those things out there.
Thank you, Mac, and thank you for channeling Shannon from prior meetings. She had an emergency come up and couldn't make it this morning, and I know she's very disappointed, as we all are, so appreciate you helping. Anne.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate all the comments so far, especially when we've got numbers behind those. And I, as a city, and I appreciate trying to really dig into what our communities need with the contextualized housing need. I just feel like this housing mix, it's not contextualized housing need, and it does not support the racial equity framework for historical inequities and looking at the housing types and getting an input from our underserved populations. What kind of housing do they want, and what kind of housing will help them with their goals, whether it's homeownership or whatever. And there was an alternative to this mix, and that's minimum densities. You know, we could look at minimum densities, which would then allow for a variety of housing types, because you can still get a lot of density with a variety of housing types and not forcing the multi-dwelling unit developments. We don't have condos in Albany. I really appreciate Brock's percentages about that. It's going to, even with the changes in state law, it's just not a form of homeownership that's popular here. I hope it will increase. And then lastly, regarding the large percentage of larger households trying to address the needs for larger bedroom size and using the family household number. A few statistics from Albany. So 65% of Albany's households are family households, but 29% of them are 65 years and older, and only 31% have people under 18 years old. The average family size is 3.1. On our Section 8 waiting list for 2 counties, Lynn and Benton counties, there are 3,625 of 3,682 families only qualify for a 1 bedroom. That's 98.5%. And then the next amount, and 36 qualify for a 2 bedroom and only a few for 3 and 4 bedroom. I'm not saying that we don't need larger bedrooms and a mix within our developments, but what we're seeing in our market rate housing is most of the bedrooms are at least 50% are 2 bedroom units, maybe 20% are 1 bedroom units, and then you have 3 bedrooms and 4 bedrooms. We're already seeing a mix that appears to accommodate multiple size families. So I'm just concerned using that family household, the B1101, the American Community Survey table, because a household is 2 people that are married that may not necessarily warrant larger bedrooms. And I assume if we're being able to contextualize our housing need, that we can address the household sizes and look at the tables that talk about our populations that are 2 people households versus 6 people households, et cetera. So I have more comments, but I'll just leave it at that. And I really do appreciate what everyone else has said. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Appreciate that insight as well. Michael.
Thanks. So the state law requires cities to do what they can to accelerate housing production at all prices. It seems to me that the thing that we know that cities can do is they can allow things to exist. That is ultimately all we're talking about here is, are we going to allow multifamily housing to exist or not? I'm confused by all the arguments that allowing a new option is not market responsive. The state is not requiring, as I understand it, cities to ban these housings, except, setting minimum density. I don't understand how setting minimum densities, i.e. banning lower densities, is going to achieve a more market responsive option. Maybe I misunderstood your argument, Anne, as a substitute for allowing higher densities. It seems to me that if we're trying to think of things that cities can do that is within their power and that is responsive to market conditions that are complicated by all the things that we're talking about here, what we should be doing is allowing homes to exist. Those are the tools on the table. We're hearing a lot of arguments for why homes should not be allowed to exist. Maybe I'm misunderstanding them, Brock. I don't know. So please, fill me in.
Yeah, cities are required to plan for 40% multi-unit housing. So it's not that we're opposed to allowing this housing to exist. We're absolutely not. It should be allowed to exist, like you're saying. The rules are making it a requirement, regardless of whether or not the market can produce it. I'll get to my other comment now because it's only one sentence. The only thing less equitable than not building enough equitable housing is not building enough housing at all.
Yeah, I fully agree there. Alexandra, did you want to chime in too?
Yeah, I think our point is not, Brock said it very well. It's not, we are more than happy to have, we're not trying to ban multifamily housing. If you ever get that impression, not even remotely our goal. We want to see more housing types, but we don't think that the prescriptiveness of these rules, sets cities up for success in actually getting that housing built. Because we can require this in this kind of theoretical way and say hey, it would be great if, but if we're not creating rules and standards that are actually reflective of the market conditions we're seeing, and B, what is achievable, I think a lot of these rules, and this is kind of a broader problem, are looking at what is aspirational and what our goal should be. And yes, that is absolutely the mindset we should be looking in kind of longer term. But we also have to be realistic about what we're seeing built today. And so I think the housing type mix is particularly problematic for my members because our communities, we're talking about contextualized housing need, making it a rebuttable presumption that is not, disaggregated by city size or region and we can talk about different ways to disaggregate that. Just having it blanket be metro, we know that a community, in Eastern Oregon or even lower in the valley, like Albany, is not going to have those same needs or really even the same market as metro to support housing, and requiring them to then rebut that presumption that the metro housing need is not what they need is creating, in fact, more work rather than less. And if the goal we're going for is less work, then either the rebuttable presumption needs to be more in line with market conditions, or it needs to be regionalized, or it needs to be a safe harbor or some other tool. I think that's the biggest problem that we see in the rebuttable presumptions, is just kind of this like, it's not even aspirational. It's not contextualized to the degree that we need for all of our communities. And that's creating this kind of issue where we're going to have to rebut them. And we don't know what rebuttal looks like. That's not laid out. And I think that's our biggest kind of question mark that we put next to all of this. And our biggest issue that ends up being is that, like, if you don't tell us what a rebuttable presumption looks like, we're gonna assume this is gonna be a really hard process. And that this is actually going to require a lot of work for us to rebut. And so that's the biggest question mark. And I've kind of gone off topic, and I'll let other people get back to what they're saying.
It's helpful, Alexandra. Thank you. I see, Thea, I'm guessing you have some clarifications to share. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I do want to hear what everybody else has to say, so I'll keep it real quick. I just want to try to provide some points of clarity. The larger household housing, that one is just, it's a safe harbor, completely optional. If it works for your community, great. If not, use whatever works for your community. The rebuttable presumption in the case of the CHN means applying the same analysis that you would in the current HPS program. There's no higher standard or higher bar to rebut than conducting the analysis that is currently required of cities. So just, hopefully that can assuage some concerns. But those are just a couple things that I just want to make sure we're understanding about how these different tools are. Back to you, Deb. Thanks.
Great, that's helpful. I'm going to move to a couple of folks that put their hand up in the middle of the conversation we haven't heard from yet, and then I'll swing back around. So Mary Kyle, I'm guessing you have some other comments on this topic.
Thank you. Yeah, it's on the percentage of housing types. I understand it would be very helpful if guidance was existed right now, and I know the staff is working on that, and I think that would be helpful. Right now, every city has to plan for multifamily housing. That's been true since the beginning of Goal 10. So it's the percentages and the fact that they're taken from Metro that seems to be setting people up. I'm not hearing any alternative percentage, and it is a rebuttable presumption. And I don't think it's serving this whole process to say that rebuttable presumptions are basically a requirement, because they're not. They have to be calibrated correctly, and the guidance would help, but they're not the same as a requirement. But I'm just also confused, since multifamily means as few as 5 units. So that seems to me very doable in most communities. And so I guess I'm echoing Michael, that I'm confused by why this is causing such a stir, because it seems cities already have to plan for zone for multifamily housing. It's as low as 5 units. That seems very capable of being accommodated in all or most cities over 10,000, which is what this applies to. I think the incremental approach, which is the other one, is not acceptable. If there's something in between, I'm open to it, but I haven't heard that. So I'm with Michael. I don't see the real problem here. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mary Kyle. Rachel.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, I have a little bit of heartburn over the numbers, that the percentages that are in the document. I just want to lift up the fact that we do need multifamily housing. And obviously in my line of work, that's what I finance primarily. So, but I also want to just say that, in some instances, we're seeing a lot of changes in the market, what is available in terms of financing. And with this in there, I fear that development that is available to take place might not take place because it doesn't fall in the box.
Okay, that it might have a suppressive effect. All right, thank you. Brianne.
Thanks. This is, I guess well, first, thank you so much for all the work that has gone into this. Now that we are like at this finish line, I can recognize how much work really has gone into this, both from this group and from DLCD staff. So thank you. And then just kind of reiterating some concerns, I think really primarily around the rebuttable presumption and just the lack of clarity in the rules about what that path actually looks like for that alternative compliance pathway. Thea, it sounds like you had said that it's kind of the same amount of work, and it's just if you come up with a different answer, that's the answer. And if that is the case, then I would ask that there be some changes in the rule to actually make that very clear, because right now I think that that's our primary concern, is there's just not really clarity in the rules at all of what a rebuttable presumption pathway looks like. And that also goes same as model code as well. So I think for us, we would just want to make sure that there's clarity in the rules and not just kind of punted to guidance to just make sure, because the rules are actual rules and enforceable. So just additional clarity on what that rebuttable presumption pathway looks like. Thanks.
That's helpful, Brianne. Thank you very much. And I'm seeing some nodding heads around. Michael and then Brock and some thumbs up. Thank you all.
Alexander, you said it is not your intent or LOC's intent or anybody's to ban multifamily zoning. I just want to be clear. Multifamily zoning is broadly illegal in Oregon. For to use one example, the waterfront zone I just looked up in Albany is described as a multifamily zone. It allows on a 10,000 square foot parcel currently up to 6 units. So like I don't mean to pick on Albany. This is the case in city after city after city after city. You have things that are described as multifamily zones that are not going to actually be built as multifamily zones. That is the status quo that we're dealing with here and should be assessing in the context of the racial equity framework. I completely agree with the arguments that we will not be built in lots and lots of cases. That's not controversial, I think. I think that what needs to happen is we need to allow the option in as many places as possible. So when we are planning for this level of growth, what we're really saying is downstream, the calculations will lead to allowing this as an option. I'm eager for ideas of how we can prevent that from having the unintended consequence of reducing the options for things to be built at lower densities.
Thank you. I might just pop over to Anne real quick. I think you posed a question that maybe Anne can shed some light on from her perspective.
Well, I just want to echo what Brianne said and Alexander said. We have no problem meeting those 40%, 20%, whatever requirements. And when all of our single dwelling unit land now is middle housing land. So that's like, 40 or 50% of our land out there. Our multi-dwelling unit zones are in a whole different chapter of the development code. Michael's looking at our mixed use zones. We have 6 climate-friendly areas that have a capacity for 12,000 units. And yes, those are mixed use zones that allow for other types of uses, but that's what we want with the climate-friendly areas. So you have to remember, we're also trying to comply with a whole set of regulations around climate-friendly areas, having mixed use developments. We can't guarantee that some of those sites will build housing, but we are now enabling housing in almost all of our zones, right? Because we want to achieve that walkable, affordable, maybe people don't need to have cars anymore. We're trying to do that. I just want to say that we do have multifamily zones, and that one that Michael brought up is not one of them.
Thanks for the clarification. I appreciate that. And to remind us all that many communities are also planning for CFEG, which have even steeper requirements. Brock.
Yeah, I just want to make clear in response to the comment that there hasn't been an alternative proposal. We've spent 2 years putting forward alternative proposals. The reason that there wasn't a prescribed housing type mix in the 2024 through 25 version of these rules adopted at the beginning of this year is because of that, right? And now we're back in this process. We're looking at a prescribed type mix again. We've said, let the cities look at what their market is able to produce, build off of that. We looked at Eco Northwest memo, break it down by city size. There have been lots and lots and lots of alternatives proposed. This is not something that has never been discussed with this group. It's been under discussion for 2 years.
Thanks. Ethan.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, I think, riff on Brianne a little bit in terms of what could be in the rules in terms of providing a little bit more structure around how a city rebuts the presumption. I think one of the things that we're wrestling with and debating and thinking through is, should that be objective in a way that really puts potentially some bounds on local governments to actually rebutting that, and therefore increasing the bar and the analytical burden and all of those things? Or is it better to be more flexible and provide flexibility to local governments to rebut the presumption in the way that makes the most sense to them? And I think that's the tricky part of trying to figure out, like, how descriptive should the state be on how local governments show that they're rebutting that presumption. And I would love to hear some thoughts from this group on, the weighing of the pros and cons of either of those approach, being very prescriptive and saying, here are all the boxes you need to check to make sure that you're actually rebutting that presumption, or should it be more left to the local government to kind of state their case? I'd be very, very interested in hear thoughts and perspectives on that question.
I might just add one item on to that. In terms of how these draft rules interact with the current program, I think they offer predictability where it doesn't currently exist, but it doesn't actually reduce any predictability. So under the current program, a local government could put forward a housing type mix, and the department could review it and find that it's insufficient or doesn't accurately represent local need. So what the compliance pathways introduce in comparison to the base rules is only avenues for predictability. It doesn't actually introduce any more unknown. And so I think I'd be curious to understand more about how folks are seeing that or not seeing that, or how the potential for predictability might benefit local governments, just because the base rules actually allow the department to come to these same conclusions with less predictability, without a rebuttable presumption or a safe harbor that a local government could rely on. And then I just wanted to name one statutory citation that I think I heard about the role that market conditions affecting the provision of needed housing was named in 197A100, and that's section 5B, if I heard correctly. And that's about the housing production strategy and the actions therein. And so, whether it's for today or future commentary that we receive, the need identification being distinct from the actions being tailored to interact with market realities and do what's within a local government's control, is something that I think would really help us process commentary.
Thanks, Celestina and Ethan. And just you've both sort of posed a question here that I think Brianne was inching towards. So I would really welcome Brianne or others to weigh in on, whether, especially around the rebuttable presumption process, whether that needs to be written in the rule, to what degree of detail, if you feel like it does. And then, obviously, as Ethan's pointed out, there's some trade-offs with that. So I'll put that on the table as well. We're right at time for this agenda item. I'm going to take a few more comments, and then we're going to need to move on because I don't want to cut these other topics short, and really appreciate the conversation. Alexandra.
I will be brief because I know Brianne will cover a lot of what I am likely to say about rebuttable presumptions. And I think it has to be something in the middle, because where you currently are is no clarity. And to be very candid, I don't think my membership trusts that with no clarity, no criteria, they will actually get a fair decision out of the agency, that it will largely be a staff by staff decision. and that there will be no capacity to then raise that up and say, hey, we don't think your staff made the right decision because there were no criteria for them to base it off of. And that's not like a slam on any of you. It is that we are all humans and we are all making decisions in a framework where there are no criteria. And that's not going to set any of us up for success. It's not going to set my members up for success. It's not going to set DLCD staff up for success. And it's just going to create a lot of conflict and consternation. And so maybe it's a list of like, you have to answer these questions or something like that, but it can't just be rebut this presumption, go ahead, and we'll give you the maximum flexibility, because then on, kind of the inverse side, there's maximum flexibility in whether or not that presumption or that rebuttal is accepted. So whether or not it's in the application of what you provide to rebut the presumption, or whether it's the decision-making criteria, one or both of those things probably needs to be included in a rule.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarity on that too, Alexandra. Brock.
Yeah, and one, echo what Alexandra said, until cities know what a rebuttal looks like, it doesn't provide certainty or clarity. It does the opposite. The other piece, I am not referring to 197A 100(5)B. I am referring to 197A 018(4)B. That is the statute for city determination of needed housing. And 4B is that it has to be responsive to local market conditions, right? If a city goes through and blindly adopts the rebuttable presumption, by definition, they haven't met their obligation under statute because they have not considered whether or not that is market feasible. For metro cities, maybe, because that's what this was already based off of. For everyone else, no.
Okay, thank you. Brianne?
I really appreciate that perspective, Ethan. It's actually helpful to see where DLCD staff is coming from when they're thinking about it. So Celestina and Ethan, I actually really appreciate that. And I wish I had an answer on the fly to that, because I can see that challenge of trying to balance allowing for more kind of discretion from the cities, but that also kind of makes it highly subjective for DLCD approval. And I think ultimately there has to be at least a little bit more specificity on what that pathway looks like. And maybe it's not overly detailed, but I think there could be some way to meet in the middle of if a city can demonstrate that they've done X, if through their analysis they're finding that their mix is X, then that's their path for an alternative compliance pathway. Because otherwise, ultimately, I feel it's just it's highly subjective, and it leaves cities just with a real lack of clarity on what to do and what that looks like, what that pathway looks like. So I think just kind of that lack of certainty, I think right now, and I appreciate that that's also trying to give flexibility too. So that perspective, your perspective really helps on that you're balancing that. But I think as it currently is, it's just really not clear of what that looks like. It from a city's perspective, it seems like it's just kind of at the discretion of DLCD. So anything that would help, I think, a city understand what that pathway looks like, and whether or not then a city can kind of balance of whether or not that's something that they would want to choose to pursue or not. But what I was hearing from Celestina is you're going to pursue it anyway. You actually have to do all that work anyway. So I guess I would want to suss that out a little bit more to understand what that looks like.
Thanks, Brianne. Appreciate that. And I'm sure everyone will keep puzzling. Julia, last comment if you have a quick one.
Yeah, it's actually just a clarifying question that I
great.
think will relate to the next section too. And it might need some conversation, so it's okay if it needs to wait out. But I think kind of what maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I'm trying to listen in on kind of everyone's comments, and what I think I'm hearing DLCD's staff say is kind of in their minds, rebuttable presumptions are rebutted by basically doing what you would have to do anyway by the base base rules without the rebuttable presumption existing. Is that a correct way to frame that, or maybe it's more nuanced than that? I'm also just trying to kind of understand the intent there.
Yeah, slight nuance, but yeah, Celestina, please.
Yeah, the only difference, and so what you just described is essentially the safe harbor, Julia, but the only difference for the rebuttable presumption is that there's a standard that actually has to be compared or rebutted. So the safe harbor is just totally optional. In rebuttable presumption land, an argument would have to be made that this need, this percentage, let's say, of multi-unit housing need actually better represents our local government's housing need than 40%. So there's a comparative bar. Whereas in a safe harbor world, that bar is not set and there's no comparative argument required. It can just be a totally different approach.
Got it. But the comparative argument is the argument is completed or made by doing the work that they would have to do by the base rule that are laid out by the base rules.
I think that's a fair description of it. Yeah. And I think in terms of like conducting that analysis, or because I guess another important thing to say is like the analysis that a local government would do, particularly around a housing type mix, is not just to say, do the assessment of here's what our existing housing type mix is. Like that doesn't seem sufficient, right? Because we're planning for the future. We have a housing production target that we're trying to meet. So that assessment of what the future housing type mix that a local government is planning towards is like grounded in the housing production target, or like that future state that we're planning towards. So that's like kind of a little bit of how we're seeing the analysis would actually be conducted at the local government, to say like, hey, we're seeing outcomes that are, through this particular housing type mix that is different than the rebuttable presumption, that's still achieving those same outcomes to meet our housing production target, for example. And therefore we have successfully rebutted that presumption.
Great. Thank you for the clarification, Ethan, and thank you all for the additional conversation. I know, well, as more details come along, the discussion gets more specific and intense, and I really appreciate weathering through that. I'm going to move us to the next one, which is community assets and harms mapping tool related to this. And I believe that's Celestina that'll give us a bit of a preview, and we'll take some time for feedback.
Yes, thanks everybody. And thanks for spending a little bit of time on this topic. I know that we haven't quite had as much dedicated agenda time on it, although we have had it available for viewing and input. So without further ado, I have basically just some snapshots of the tool today to describe a little bit about how it's laid out and developed, and some of the functionality of it and some of the intention behind it. But again, mostly going to leave time for you all to discuss. So on a basic level, you'll see sort of toward the middle of the screen, toward the bottom, this 4x4 display with what we call a bivariate scoring method. And so this tool is intended to understand sort of environmental conditions, but not environmental only referring to trees and soils, but really anything that's represents the conditions of one's environment in two different ways. One, the things that we might consider assets or benefits, and the other being things we might consider harms or detriments. This largely comes from the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Framework and having equitable access to, well, really having fair housing choice locationally, being able to live wherever one chooses, and also not having disproportionate burden for any one community of living in proximity to harms and things like that. So that's where this frame comes from. And because they really are different concepts, the bivariate scoring method, so really maintaining the ability to see both how many assets there are relatively and how many harms there are relatively, rather than combining those into one total score, is really valuable. And you'll see how the hex coloring plays out, and what is really revealed by maintaining that bivariate approach. And the reason I'm spending a couple minutes talking about that is because it's really at the core of what we think the value of this tool might be, because we wanted to be really clear that the tool is not intended to identify, some absolute gold star areas, and that those areas should become the only place that a local government or developers or community members think housing should be. That is not the purpose of the tool. The purpose is to better understand the varying relative conditions in a local government, to identify what the most responsive action might be in a given area. And so that can be different. There might be mitigating actions that are needed in areas with closer proximity to harms, or different styles of development that might be better suited. So that's why I really wanted to highlight that approach. Certainly, of course, open to feedback, but out the gate, just wanted to name that the purpose of the tool is not to make all or nothing determinations about any given area, but just to actually get some more context, contextual understanding. So with that, let me start clicking through here. At its core, then we need to understand the assets that are being understood and the harms that are being understood. And so this is close to a complete list, but not quite, only because the screen viewer couldn't get through all of them for my screen grab. But we do have a memo that we released earlier this summer that names the current indicators, is what they're called in the mapping world, for each of these assets and harms. These can certainly and sort of should be up for discussion. The data sources underneath them are up for discussion. And the tool is designed in such a way that you can look at them in totality. That was sort of the original goal, but also that you can look at one or a few at a time. So that's an ancillary benefit, that if one of these indicators is of particular importance or feels really prominent to an issue that a local government is having, you can isolate those variables. So there's some benefits in that usability. So I'll click through a little bit on how a local government might interact with the tool. I pick on Salem because it's the capital, not for any other reason. So this is Salem. And you start on the left-hand side, you select the urban growth boundary that you're interested in digging into. And then you select the indicators that you want to see. Like I mentioned, the sort of standard use case for this was to select all indicators to be able to understand, for the data sources that we have, the indicators that we have, sort of the totality of assets and harms relative to one another, and then compared. So you'll see here that the more purely blue areas are areas with higher assets and low harms. The more solidly orange areas are going to have more harms and less assets. The sort of greeny area will be a fairly high level of both. And then the less colorful, more grayscale boxes are going to have low scores on both relatively. And again, this is all within the urban growth boundary. So just trying to understand relative conditions in the city, although the tool also allows you to toggle to compare by region or compare by state. And different indicators are going to respond pretty differently to that, especially those that have, let's say, statewide trends, like wildland urban interface is one that within a city might respond very differently than compared statewide, for example. So there are a lot of considerations in those other use cases, but for the time being, just thinking about the urban growth boundary amendment, or I'm sorry, not amendment, the urban growth boundary as the geography here that we're looking at, I wanted to show you what it looks like to interact with each of those hexes. Oh, and I forgot about the screeners, so let me pause for a moment there. There are a few screeners. So as you can see, when you click, for example, highway, that is highlighted on the screen rather than being incorporated into the methodology or the indicators underneath. And the thinking on the screeners is that they have a more acute impact perhaps, that is worth really isolating and understanding, separate from the total assets and harms. And it may not necessarily fall as discretely in an assets and harms understanding, or maybe it does, but really being able to isolate it out while still looking at the underneath methodology is the thinking there. So we have a few screeners that you can toggle on and off as well. And so when you want to look at a particular hex, you hover over a hex, and I should have sort of highlighted it there for you, but it's at the top left corner of that black box. There's a view where you can get a general sense of which percentile of the 25 percentile increments that hex is showing up for harms and assets. And then you can click further. I think that actually is the hover. And then when you click, you can see each indicator breakdown, which percentile each indicator is showing up. So that's just a basic walkthrough of the functionality. And hopefully the primer at the beginning got more at the purpose of this and the value that we think it might offer. And I'll just close before discussion with renaming what Thea opened up with at the top, which is that this tool is currently not, implicated in any one-to-one requirement or compliance pathway. And what I mean by that is, there's some data from the American Community Survey that's on the housing equity indicators that is sort of used in a one-to-one way to create compliance pathways, for example, in the contextualized housing need. While this tool is named as an input for a local government to look to consider and incorporate in its analysis, because there is some pretty obvious information that's relevant, there are no one-to-one sort of directives about what conclusions a local government should have or find from using the tool. So with that, I will just open it up. If there are clarifying questions about any of that, great. And if not, also happy to just jump right into the details.
Questions about the mapping tool or anything you just saw, or if you all had a chance to tool around with it on your own? Yeah, Alan.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, I think this tool is great in its application, in its opportunity for application. I have a couple questions about the implementation of it. One is, I guess I'm curious about, and maybe this happened along the way and I just haven't followed it enough, kind of how the assets and harms were identified. So for instance, a potential either asset or harm would be other demographics related to concentrations of either wealth or poverty. And so I don't know if this tool is intended to be able to identify those types of things, or if there are other tools like the equity indicators that are used for that. So this is not intended to encompass everything. Is that right?
That's correct, Vice Chair Lazo. And I can just confirm that actually at the moment, both the equity indicators, which has an indicator on segregation, income and racial segregation and concentration, and DLCD's Community Explorer tool, which was also recently launched, both have focus on demographic information and either focus on or include income and racial segregation. And the goal is that on the DLCD side, we'll be able to create an interface where you can compare and sort of layer, while also not conflating the environmental information with the demographic information.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Oh, okay. I just don't know if there'd be value in that or not. I love this kind of tool. The other comment I'll make about this particular tool, and again, maybe it's not pertinent now because of the way it's used, is I clicked over the Portland UGB one, and it's in smaller cities, it might be easier to figure out where you are, but contextually, without the map underneath showing through, it's kind of hard to tell where what exactly is this hex, what neighborhood is it in? So maybe if you click on it and identify the census tract or something, it might give you a little bit more context of exactly where you are, and only because the map doesn't show through the hexes. So, small point.
That's
Thanks,
great. Yeah, thank you. That That's great feedback, and even those sort of user interface items are totally fair game and welcome, because I think adjustments can be made.
Thank you. Karen.
Hi, I just also wanted to compliment you guys on this tool. It's really, it's very interesting to look at. I love data. I do think one recommendation I would make is that it would be nice to be able to select several places, because I know for unincorporated Clackamas County, it's broken into different jurisdictions. I mean, different areas like Jennings Lodge or Oatfield or different things like that. So it's difficult for us to be able to see the whole of Clackamas County together. So I think that would be, if it's easy enough to select several jurisdictions or places, that would be great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that. Brock.
So what are the data sources for wildfire risk and for the wildland urban interface that go into the map?
I can pull up that memo and link it in the chat on the side, Brock. But if you have comments you want to offer right off the top about which ones you think are better or worse, please feel free.
Well, the comment that I'm going to offer off the top is that, as I understand it from the memo previously, the wildfire risk and wildland urban interface are based off of the Senate Bill 762 maps, which were repealed. I don't think it's appropriate to use a data source that's, one, not going to be updated, and two, was repealed for a number of different reasons, to inform a tool that we're going to use for future planning when we've taken that other map off the table. The legislature has taken that other map off the table.
Okay, thank you. Mac.
Yeah, I just also want to offer kudos and compliments for getting to pull together something as big as this to cover our jurisdictions statewide. So again, compliments there. In terms of usability, I think that I also see a lens of how this can be useful, not just from a jurisdictional standpoint, but even from my side of the table and trying to cite projects. And so I want to highlight that usability there. I want to echo and second Commissioner Lazo's comments about census tracts. I want to second as well the ability to have a satellite view to more clearly kind of be able to see within your jurisdictions where you are. One way to do that might be allowing an opacity sort of measure with the layer. So you can change it that way. And then one other thing, selfishly, if I may, that could, I think, be interesting to add to this is HUD's current and year prior qualified census tracts, as well as difficult development areas. Those different census tracts and whatnot entitle an affordable housing project that uses the low-income housing tax credit program to a 30% bonus in tax credits, which makes getting proposals from investors, it's just more attractive to an investor because they get more upside, and it also helps the project because there's more equity available, which means there's less reliance or less need to rely on public subsidy to fill in whatever that additional bonus 30% in tax credits. And so I just want to offer those sorts of notes in there, and also liked, I'm sorry, Karen's note about multiple jurisdictions, I think would be really great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mac. I like hearing about all the different ways people are thinking about using this tool. Ariel, welcome. I saw you earlier and you popped off, and glad you made it back.
Yeah, sorry, tech issues this morning. Yeah, good morning. I am excited about all the different tools that DLCD and the state have been creating to make data more accessible and make these analyses a little bit easier. I think that just one comment across all of the different tools is that usability highly increases in its value if we're able to download these data sets and be able to do some of our own local analyses and be more comprehensive. For example, looking at some of these assets and harms and looking at our own zoning spatial files and being able to do the intersections between all of these. You know, I think OHDS has some of their tools and you guys have some of your other tools. Being able to download these sets and really do a comprehensive analysis across all of them would be really valuable for us. And then the last thing I'd say is because we also do, some of us have local data that we like to use and we want to understand how it compares to state data that's available. I don't see in some of these on the tool itself, though it might exist elsewhere, where data sources have come from. I think it's just helpful to have it all all in the same space. So if there's the possibility to add source information to the abouts or anything like that on the actual interface, that would be great.
Great, thank you. And saw lots of support for your idea for a downloadable data set, so more local analysis can be done. Julia.
Yeah, just wanted to give kudos and as at least DLCD staff now, maybe some others. This was a tool that I was really enthused to kind of see created by the state. And so it's just great to see the update and kind of see it become real. And also excited to hear that jurisdictions are excited to have this as a resource. And also, yeah, just love Ariel's recommendation for making it downloadable too for further usability. So yeah, great. Thanks for including this in the update today too.
Great, thank you all. This leaves us with the perfect moment to take a break. So let's do that and let's come back at 10:30 on the dot and we'll get the agenda back on track. So see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Hello, all. Welcome back. All right, let's keep going. We have quite a bit still to cover. We're going to pick up the HPS Actions, Compliance Pathways, and Acceleration Program together, and then we'll shift to model code. So, Thea, take it away.
Thank you. And if we get the slides when you get a chance, Celestina, I'll say that unlike in the CHN section, there were some sort of more significant changes in the HPS between versions 1 and version 2. And that's what you can see here indicated in orange. I will I review each of these pretty quickly and identify some feedback themes and talk about what those changes look like. You'll recall that these largely align with the key needs in the CHN compliance pathways, and most point back to the model code, which we'll talk about more at the end of this session. The most significant shift here was to adjust that multi-unit action, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Accessible, adaptable, and a new affordable provision use a rebuttable presumption approach to apply incentives and bonuses that are described in the model code or demonstrate that another action is likely to provide commensurate incentives in those areas. And finally, you'll remember the adjustment that allows density to be calculated by bedroom rather than unit specifically for affordable housing. And that's currently in draft as a minimum standard. So that's what this table is breaking down. You can go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. Sorry, Celestina, let's click to the next slide when you get a chance. Thank you. So the model code or equivalent application on land zoned for middle housing here is proposed as a minimum standard, largely based on that analysis from Echo Northwest that shows that it's the most feasible housing type to produce across jurisdictions, including at different city sizes and regions. This provision liberalizes the standards for this type of development in most areas that currently allow middle housing, which are all residentially zoned lands. I'll say in response to feedback, an important addition in version 2 is a provision that requires the local government to produce findings regarding lands that they intend to include or exclude in those planning areas identified above, and describing how those decisions affirmatively further fair housing. So this is really critical to ensure that those patterns of investment, segregation, concentration, and opportunities are really carefully, critically considered in that evaluation. We can go to the next slide. So as we reflected in the notes, multi-unit housing is, super critical to meet Oregon's housing need. Like the middle housing provision and the others, this provision is sets standards that align with the model code. So version 1 included a narrower provision, encouraging cities to apply that model code for multi-unit housing on lands that were currently zoned for that intensity, or to demonstrate that their zoning allows for a commensurate level of development using a rebuttable presumption tool. So we heard significant concern that this was too narrow an intervention to effectively meet that need. So version 2 takes a different tack. So it provides for sort of a much greater land area to be zoned for multi-unit housing, but applies that as a safe harbor, making that path encouraged, but completely optional. So for multi-unit, like this less prescriptive orientation would apply that model code or the equivalent on all development ready lands and half of all buildable lands as identified in those respective inventories. And here too, the use of the safe harbor requires that locational analysis that we discussed in the above provision regarding middle housing to ensure that fair housing outcomes are really deeply considered as a required element of that compliance pathway. We can go to the next slide. All right. So this provision is a relatively small one-time change. I think that we've talked about before, allowing cities to calculate that density with bedroom count rather than unit count for affordable housing developments. And the goal of this is to incentivize larger household sizes or household units with a greater number of bedrooms by giving cities credit toward their density goals. So aside from some clarifications, we've really received very little feedback on this one. We can go to the next slide. So based on written feedback and the deep dive with accessibility experts that we mentioned before, land use efficiency measures to address accessible and adaptable housing need were shifted under the rebuttable presumption tool to sort of elevate that to a slightly higher level of prescription. The content of the pathways remains the same, so incentivizing that development of properties with accessibility features per the bonuses in the model code. We can go to the next slide. All right, and finally, we heard significant concern that the department had not provided a compliance pathway to meet affordable need. You know, acknowledging that only so much can be addressed via land use efficiency measures in this area, staff did find that establishing a rebuttable presumption in alignment with sort of the accessible and adaptable provisions and pointing to those model code bonuses made sense in this circumstance and responded to that feedback that we were getting. So I think we can pull that slideshow down and go to discussion from here. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all think.
Great, thank you. I saw some clapping and some hearts and some thumbs up to some of those provisions, so it'd be great to hear more about that as well. Mac, please.
Yeah, thank you. Again, first and foremost, I want to thank staff for that inclusion of the ability to calculate minimum density for affordable housing via bedroom density. I have been meaning to follow up and just some things have been getting in the way, but I think at minimum, staff connecting with Housing Oregon about what is like a reasonable threshold for what like minimum bedroom density would kind of need to be met to accomplish that, and just offer some clarification to jurisdictions to accompany this rule language. I think it's probably going to make sense in terms of that next step and make sure that you're getting more than just my perspective from the affordable housing perspective there on what folks would like to see. So that's the first plug. And then the second one is appreciation for the inclusion of an affordable housing compliance pathway for the HPS. Even if it's just pointing back to the code, and again, I appreciate, of course, the commentary. Affordable housing needs a lot more than just land use fixes to increase the visibility of projects, but having land use be one less barrier is a great feather to have in our caps as developers to bring forward those projects statewide. And so I'll leave it there for now. Again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mac. Appreciate that. Appreciate all the efforts leading up to this point of getting this draft rule as well. Other comments, questions, concerns? Garland, hi, welcome.
Hello. I guess I should probably introduce myself.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Garland Woodsong. I'm the exec director of Place Initiative. We're a national nonprofit focused on elevating urbanism as a climate strategy for equitable outcomes. And so my comments are made with that in mind of how to promote urbanism, how to promote equitable outcomes. I'm also the chair of the Oregon Cooperative Housing Network. And so my comments also reflect our desire to promote more housing cooperatives, including limited equity cooperatives throughout Oregon. Yeah, my comments today on these rules are on how they can more directly advance integration, infill, and community ownership while reducing pressure on urban growth boundaries. First, on integration, I strongly support the fair housing issue area analysis requirement, but it needs more teeth. The model code should be required, not optional, in areas identified as having racial or income segregation. For large cities, the 50% threshold should rise to at least 75% of buildable land, prioritized towards historically exclusionary single-family zones. Second, on infill versus expansion, I support the provisions that discount capacity on undeveloped sites after 2 or 3 housing cycle analyses. This directly limits sprawl pressure. But we should go further and require that land use efficiency measures and infill opportunities be fully maximized before any urban growth expansion is considered. Third, on community ownership, the income agnostic homeownership goals are excellent. They open the door for community land trusts and limited equity co-ops. That intent should be explicit in the rule text. And the model code's affordability bonuses should be enhanced for permanently affordable models that build intergenerational wealth. Fourth, on development-ready land, I support the new inventory framework. Readily served should favor infill parcels already within service networks and be stricter for greenfield sites. Finally, on the acceleration program, the audit framework should explicitly flag exclusionary zoning and the concentration of affordable housing in already diverse areas as barriers requiring remediation. In short, these rules move in the right direction, strengthening the integration requirements, prioritizing infill over expansion, and explicitly enabling community land trusts and co-ops will help Oregon truly align housing production with equity, climate, and land efficiency goals. And I'll follow up with written comments.
Great, thanks, Carlin. Lots to chew on there, and appreciate your attention to detail on those. Are there comments, concerns, clarifications needed? Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
So I have a clarification that I have. For the accessible, adaptable, and affordable housing, as we're thinking about that rebuttable presumption, is it that it is only the portions of the model code that address incentives that need to be addressed at that point in time? And is that clearly stated that way within the rules, that it is only the incentive portions that would need to be discussed in that rebuttable presumption?
Staff have any insights on intent there anyway?
Yes, you're correct, Karen. That's sort of the intention is to follow directly from the need to the action. And so that's why they're broken out in that way. And the model code sort of action that's available is exactly those incentives. So to meet adaptable need, it's the adaptable incentives. To meet affordable need, it's the affordable incentives.
Thanks. I definitely haven't spent as much time as other folks, combing through this code, but during kind of the initial read, it wasn't as clear that it really is just a portion of the model code. I think there's a lot of concern about the time it would take if we were looking at our code holistically in comparison to the model code holistically. And it's really helpful to understand that there are sections of the model code that need to be looked at for these different kind of categories, and being able to be clear about that. I think that would help jurisdictions understand what their kind of the workload it will take.
Great. Thank you. Really helpful insight. And I'm sure I know we'll be talking more about the model code writ large in a moment here as well. Other clarifications or questions on the HPS compliance? Julia?
Yeah, kind of on a similar note, wanted to thank you all for responding to some of the feedback that I know our coalition had given related to the kind of expanding where zoning exists versus just working within what is already there. And kind of similar to Karen's comments, I haven't had the capacity to really, really dig into the rules text, but in my first initial read, the staff commentary made that intention much more clear than I felt the rules did. And so just kind of making sure, because when I first read the rules language, I didn't feel like that was reflected. When I was reading the SOS version, I kind of was like, wait, they didn't hear our feedback. And then when I saw your commentary that you had and that was your intention, I just wanted to flag that there might be a little bit of a need to add further clarification in how that is framed. Also, it might just be my sleepy brain from trudging through all the rules language. So, but yeah, again, thank you for doing that. Also, just wanted to thank you for layering in more directly kind of the fair housing and equity components in terms of expecting a locational analysis related to any of those zoning applications as well. I thought that was a really fantastic addition, which I think was inherent in the rules, but I think that explicitness to just really highlight that fair housing and equity lens is really helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. Appreciate that. Brock.
So a question about the application of model codes by LCDC more generally. 197320, that's the statute that, as of 2025, subsection 13 there is what was added through the owner process. LCDC shall issue an order requiring the local government, blah, 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 to implement whatever, if the commission has good cause to believe city with a population of 10,000 or greater practice of violating housing related statutes, creating adverse or disparate impacts, didn't enter an acceleration agreement, or breached an acceleration agreement. How does that allow for the rules to require more or less? And again, this is similar to the needed housing type mix rebuttable presumption. I don't see what the process is for saying our local code is at least as flexible. And it's further specified that, if any provision of their local development standards aren't as flexible as the model code. So how does that jive with the rules here, where the model code is being required to be applied essentially right through 3?
Brock, I think you're getting into an area that we thought might happen, which is we'll pick this up for sure in the next agenda item under model code. I think that's a good focus for that. But okay, are you okay putting a pin in that? Because we kind of knew that would be a topic for discussion. Okay, great. Thank you. So sticking with compliance pathways at this point, or as much as we can, Alexandra.
This kind of goes into what Brock was saying, but I will say just the implementation of the model code as a minimum standard, as specifically as it relates to compliance pathways, is inappropriate, largely because it is directly out of alignment with the legislative intent of 1564, in which cities agreed and supported the bill only on the basis this would not be a mandatory model code. This was submitted for the record by the legislative sponsors and everything that Brock has pointed to. So I will put that there. It is not an objection to affirmatively furthering fair housing. It is not us not wanting to participate in this work. It is specifically that you are requiring something of cities that is outside of alignment with what was negotiated in the original authorizing legislation. And we are more than happy to find a solution to what this looks like to use an alternate system, but the system that you're utilizing unfairly punishes cities, requires us to change codes that actively already work, and is just deeply inappropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Michael.
Should I save a response to that for the model code discussion?
Well, maybe go ahead and let's see where you go with this, and we might continue on in a moment here.
Is the argument that the text of 1564 doesn't allow this, or the text of 2001 doesn't allow this?
I saw Brock.
Sorry?
It's both.
Go ahead, Alexandra.
Well, 1564 was directed as optional adoption of model codes. House Bill 2001, when it amended 197320, added that subsection 13 where the commission can apply that model code. There's a couple other statutes about process and stuff like that, but the commission has to have good cause to believe that a city is violating housing laws, either by, creating unreasonable cost or delay, not having clear and objective standards, right? Creating adverse impacts, failing to enter an acceleration agreement, or failing to comply with one. but doing that preemptively as a requirement for the HPS is not in response to a city's violation of one of those provisions. It preempts that. But the commission has to have that justification that it believes the city is violating one of those provisions in order to be able to apply the model code directly.
Okay, thanks. So to flesh out my earlier point with more examples other than just the one zone in Albany, which again, I wasn't picking on Albany, the status quo, the very highest density residential zone in Medford on a 10,000 square foot lot currently allows 7 units, in Springfield 9 units, in McMinnville 5 units, in Newburgh 6 units, in Grants Pass 11 units. This is on a 10,000 square foot lot, and this is the very highest density zone, which in many cases, residential zone, which in many cases is on a very small amount of the total land of the city. So whatever the means by which the state is assessing current zoning, it doesn't seem to me that this is possibly in compliance with the intent of 2001, this status quo. We need to find some way to allow more options within multifamily zones for this to be viable. That was part of the Eco Northwest finding that you cited earlier, Brock. Yeah, this seems to me to be an elegant way to do it. There is this set of codes that has been developed. And if a city has another approach to get their zoning to that comparable level of liberalization, it seems to me that these rules provide that. But there needs to be some sort of standard.
Well, definitely. Thank you, Michael. We'll definitely get there. I just want to, before we shift over to model code more generally, I just want to bring us back to HPS compliance pathways, which include some rebuttable presumptions and safe harbors regarding model code, but also others. So I just want to make sure there aren't other comments on HPS compliance pathways before we move on. And I don't need to belabor this. So Brock, specific to HPS compliance, or Alexander, or okay. So Matt.
Yeah, I'd just like to express my appreciation to DLCD for elevating the compliance pathway for adaptability. I think it had been a safe harbor. It's a rebuttable presumption on the compliance pathway. So that was a good approach for this part of it.
Great. Thank you very much for that. It's helpful to know that. All right. I'm going to move us along. We can always come back to this as time allows, but I'm going to move us along to model code because obviously that's where we are, and pass it over to Sean to give a bit of a presentation on the rules and the code in front of us, and then we'll carry on from there.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Deb. And should I drive slides, or Celestine, were you on that? I'm happy to do it. Oh, great. Perfect.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to touch on just kind of some of the updates to the model code, including the actual codes themselves, as well as the kind of implementing administrative rules. And we'll kind of pick up that discussion again, talking about how the model code, where it's used as a benchmark, how that works, and talk about that in relationship to, different development outcomes that can be achieved through local land use regulations. But I'll start with just a quick recap on the statutory and policy direction. So Senate Bill 1564, as pointed out, was more pointed direction around DLCD and LCDC's broad direction around the use of model codes as both a compliance tool and as a resource for facilitating action at the local level. What Senate Bill 1564 specifically required were the development of codes for 4 housing types that are listed on the left here, segmented by city size for 3 different population sizes. We colloquially call these small, medium, and large. And then to stitch everything together, we need a set of model procedures to review and approve development applications by. Now, I won't cover in full detail, right, or re-review the kind of different rules that we have available. I'll talk about some of the updates in some of the forthcoming slides, but there's different functions that are kind of prescribed in different areas of statute. Just really briefly, one is optional adoption and application by reference. That's directly from Senate Bill 1564. There's one related to kind of housing law compliance, where especially where local codes might not comply with a housing law. So this is an option that's provided in rule using 197646. There's kind of a comparative benchmark for action, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then, of course, the application as an LCDC enforcement tool, which was outlined in 197, was at 320 before. So if we can move to the next slide. I do want to provide just a little bit of a backdrop on some of the policy objectives. These are some of the initial policy objectives that we had discussed that connect into the racial equity framework, about like what we're actually trying to achieve with these different codes and what the refinement of the codes and the rules themselves really kind of used as a North Star, which was around kind of facilitating, housing choice, housing diversity, facilitating production, especially in high opportunity areas, making housing development processes more streamlined, right? And of course, increasing community capacity and resilience too, in support of actually implementing this legislative direction. So I just want to keep that in the back of our mind as we think about this. This was a big kind of guiding principle as we worked on the refinement of the code. Move to the next slide. So where we left off in June earlier this year, we had published kind of a preliminary draft model code. The idea here was that we gathered a lot of different code provisions from other models that we developed. We had kind of some initial conversations. We wanted to get ideas out there on a page for the purpose of facilitating discussion, right? And that was the intent of the June model code, right? A lot of preliminary concepts and discussion items that were in there, but we knew they needed refinement. We knew they needed to be honed to better facilitate the objectives that we were after, right? So over the past couple of months, most notably in August and September, we launched a broader kind of engagement process with local governments and developers around the state. We basically used our kind of existing contact networks for both, reached out to a bunch of folks and said, hey, we're doing this kind of refinement of this model code. It'd be very helpful if not only if you had any case examples that you'd be willing to share with us that we could use to stress test the model code, but if you could also, if we could connect with you and discuss one-on-one about kind of different issues that you might face. And we had a lot of folks that kind of took us up on those offers, including some folks on this work group as well. I know you guys all received that, and we really appreciate a lot of the feedback that was provided and a lot of the case examples that were provided. They were very helpful. It was a great also opportunity for us as part of the HAPO to actually start connecting with folks, especially in the development community. A lot of folks didn't really know about our office, and that became apparent in conversations as we were talking about different things, right? And of course, we also drew from kind of any existing feasibility and market studies that we had available to us. For example, the CFEC market studies that we had available, just to help inform, what can we take away from this for refinement of the code. So all of these kind of combined really helped inform a lot of changes to the model code that I think make it function a lot better at actually achieving the intended outcomes. I'll talk a little bit about those in the next coming slides, if we can move to the next slides. So I'll divide these updates into two parts. I'll start with the refinements to the model code itself, and then I'll move to talking about the rules and some of the refinements that were therein. Something I'll just point out, we know, like we've been working on just getting these codes developed, published, drafted, that kind of thing, and out there for public comment. They've been available on the website, not for a very long time, and they're very long documents, so I don't expect folks to have read these, and nor do I expect folks to have like the finality of all the recommendations, especially the fine-grained ones as we get into discussion here, though we do want to leave an opportunity to discuss those. These are available for public comment through November 7th, right? So we really encourage, as you guys, have the time to get in there with a fine-tooth comb, to really start, poking in and looking at some of those refinements and, providing suggestions to make the final code better. We still think that this is still a work in progress, and we expect that it'll be refined before the final adoption, and it will continue to be refined after it's adopted too. It's intended to be a living document that we're going to build on over time. So if we can move to the next slide. I will highlight some of the major changes from the last draft, and I'm going to start with one that I think is just important to note at the top. We had some conversations about small cities. So for context, these are cities below 2,500. They do not have regular Goal 10 planning obligations. Many of the housing laws that we're talking about don't actually apply to small cities, though some do, especially around like clear and objective standards, things like that. And oftentimes, small cities in this kind of population range often lack resources to really do a whole lot of anything, right? Including even administering the code. Sometimes you just have a city recorder on staff, right? And so one of the kind of choices that we made from the original code, which had all the codes lumped together, is that we really thought that it was important to optimize this small cities code for simplicity and administration, right? Really thinking about that small city with very limited capacity to do implementation. So we broke this out into its own standalone code. The large and medium cities will be broken out in in the final, but they're kind of kept together now because there's a lot of, standards that apply to both, right? And so it'd be very duplicative if we broke it out at this point. But in the small cities model code, it's basically a whole different functionality, and it's really focused on making the allowances, making the applicable standards much more simple and easy to understand and administer at the local level for a small capacity constrained city. Now, I should mention, this comes with some trade-offs, right? Especially in terms of development flexibility. In the large and medium cities, we really thought a lot about like, all right, how are we achieving different public policy objectives? How are we embedding flexibility in different things? And that means that kind of while that adds flexibility for development, it does make it more complicated and difficult to administer, right? So this code really focused in on honing it down, like, what do we need to have is basically the bare essentials to make this code work. And so it's optimized for that kind of optional adoption by reference. And there's a lot more use of what we would call recommended standards, which are defined in rule as basically, hey, this is promising practice. These would apply by default, but you have the ability to specify something else if you so choose, right? Okay, so that's the small cities model code. Let's move on to the large, medium and large cities code. Again, there were a lot of changes that went into the medium and large cities code that were informed by a lot of the outreach process that we underwent. I'm going to touch on these on a pretty high level, but I'm going to talk a little bit about them and talk about some of the themes that we were kind of unpacking. The first one I'll point out is that while we were developing the code, there was a session underway, and there were multiple bills that were passed that affect the application of housing laws. And there's a timing issue because we have to adopt these codes by the end of the year, but there's going to be rulemaking that happens in the future. So there's a tension that exists there. And what we had to do in this kind of next draft of the code is, to the extent that we could, kind of conform with the statutory language in those laws. That includes House Bill 2138, as well as Senate Bill 974. And that included some provisions around, say, residential design standards, and 974 that included certain allowances for different middle housing types to be attached or detached, that type of thing. And, additions to existing units, et cetera, changes to the middle housing land division statute. We had basically kind of incorporated these to the best of our ability in this code, recognizing, hey, there's going to be future rulemaking that happens. That's going to establish parameters around siting and design, and that might necessitate a change to this code in the future. That's okay. This code is designed to be updated on a regular basis. It's going to be kept updated as laws change, right? So that was just one update that's included in here. The second point that I want to touch on is around the applicable siting and design regulations. I think one of the big things that we found in our outreach to folks, and of course, evaluating different site plans, is around like, okay, there's this buildable envelope that we included in the original draft code. That seems to be pretty conducive to a lot of different development, site plans that we've observed, things like that. But a lot of the devil in the details really revolves around how are we balancing the different kind of public policy objectives that we're trying to achieve with kind of permissibility and development. And one of the big themes, I think this was a big tension as we've always talked about in the rulemaking process, is that tension on how do you balance these different competing objectives of providing a very permissive development code versus also achieving discrete public policy objectives, right? These can be in tension with each other at times. And really, in part of this refinement, we really sought to try to find kind of mutual wins, ways that we could advance both. But there were going to be times where we have to choose where we're going to strike a balance, right? There are people who want to see this code be more permissive. There are people who want to see this code be, more restrictive for specific reasons. And there's always going to be a tension between those two things. We'll never hit that right balance, right? When we get into it, we're trying to balance this as much as we can in line with the policy objectives. So I just wanted to make that clear right at the front. But there were a lot of good refinements that we considered in light of a lot of the good feedback we got, things related to like minimum lot sizes, which we had not included in this newest draft, around kind of the application of minimum density, which we kind of refined and honed in on, as well as the application of different design standards, things like that, really around kind of helping support those dual objectives of making sure we have a permissive code, but making sure that those codes achieve very specific public policy objectives. Okay. I also want to mention, too, that we had more of a refinement of a lot of the flexibility and bonuses that were included in for specifically accessible and adaptable housing. So like thinking a lot about not only like, are those bonuses well calibrated? What are we actually asking for? Like, what is the trade-off, like in terms of how many accessible units we're talking about? We included a category for cooperative housing, right? In light of a comment that was mentioned previously by Garland. So thank you for that. But yeah, also thinking just about like what flexibilities are going to be provided in exchange. How do we make sure that we calibrate it such that it's a meaningful, kind of trade-off that incentivizes these outcomes, right? And so that was kind of another refinement that went into this next draft of the code. And then I'll also just mention, when it came to the procedures, the first draft code was pretty light on procedure. It did include a ministerial pathway. This new one includes kind of a refinement to that. It has a ministerial pathway and specifically a zoning like code like check process that's included in there. As well as kind of an administrative limited land use decision process that's designed to also help facilitation of complying with that statute. And there's also the Middle Housing Land Division, right? That was updated by state law. We incorporated those changes into this next draft. And we've also designed these to be distinct modules that could be taken off the shelf and implemented to comply with the housing law. So if you're a city and you have maybe outdated codes or you never implemented the Middle Housing Land Division, you have this that's available for you as a resource. So that's another change that was included in this. So again, very high level overview. I want to leave a time for discussion on this point, so I'm not going to go into much more exhaustive detail about all the specific, kind of changelog edits. But that's kind of the themes of how we approach this different this refinement process for the medium and large cities model code. If we can move to the next section. I'm going to start talking about now some of the rule refinements. So I believe at our last meeting, we had discussed some kind of initial kind of draft rules that we were going to be working on refining and including in the Secretary of State notice, and of course for consideration by the Commission later this month. There were some refinements that were included in that, and I'll kind of summarize those in the next slide. If we can move to the next slide really quickly. Just a reminder, this rule is pretty kind of, it's in its own section, and it's really dedicated specifically just for model codes. And we talked about kind of they implement 4 kind of main functionalities, I guess 5 if you include the fact that we're actually adopting the codes into rules, so they have regulatory weight. But the 4 main functions really revolve around that kind of optional adoption and application by reference. The second one being, complying with the housing laws I've mentioned throughout this presentation, the comparison to local action and land use regulations, that topic that we put a pin in that I'll discuss more in a little bit, and then of course the mandatory application through an LCDC enforcement order. Of course, all of these amended drafts and rules, they're all available for public comment through November 7th. Just really want to emphasize we encourage submitting public comments to help refine the final drafts of these. If we can move to the next section. All right, now in terms of the actual rule refinements themselves, when we discussed at our last meeting, there were some, good points around kind of clarifications around the applicability of different terms, the precision, all these different kind of components. And a lot of the refinements that happened in this rule were around those concepts. So like really focusing on providing additional clarity and precision in the terms that we're using, making sure things have more precise definitions. So that way applicability in different contexts is clearer, right? When we're talking about applying the code, how does it apply? How does it interact with other things? Let's make sure we have precision around that language. So that way we know precisely when things apply and when they don't. That was a big part of the underlying kind of refinements to this rule. So that's one kind of big component. You see that in basically throughout the rule, and kind of clarification to help make things read easier and make them more clear and implementable on the ground. I also want to note that there were kind of clarification of some of the flexibilities in the optional adoption by reference, specifically around kind of recommended standards, making sure that that was clear what that means and how that applies. And of course, also clarifying the concept that, cities should always be allowed to, if they want to, if they choose to, allow a greater intensity or density in a particular zone, while also, kind of safeguarding if they have higher density designated zones that you wouldn't allow lower density that can't meet the minimum density requirements in that zone. So there's some clarifications around that in rule as well. And then this next section, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a following slide, there were 2 kind of more substantive edits in the use of the model code as a comparative benchmark. So one was around minimum density. So the model code includes some provisions around minimum density, basically to ward off against kind of underbuilding scenarios that can result in some kind of really odd outcomes in terms of what actual development looks like on the ground. So the model code does include some minimum density provisions for new construction. And basically, the rule clarifies it's like, hey, minimum density is really kind of a zoning thing. And so we're not going to be using that as part of this comparative benchmark when we're talking about siding standards. So just making that very clear in the rule. And then the second one is really around adding another kind of flexibility around incentives or bonuses. We talked about that a little bit in the last, the compliance pathways, just really around saying, hey, there should be flexibility for local governments to develop their own kind of incentive or bonus programs, provided they have kind of comparable economic benefit. Now, I think something that we've heard and we see that like there's maybe a little bit of confusion or maybe not a whole lot of awareness around is around the application of the model code when it's, say used comparatively to local land use regulations. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time going into the weeds on this before we get into discussion. If we can move to the next slide. And I think this is a question of like, all right, we see that there's this rule here. The intent of this rule is to provide flexibility to local governments in the recognition that, hey, the model code is one way of regulating housing development. There can be other ways of regulating housing development that achieve comparable outcomes. And that's great. We should encourage that, right? And so that's really what this rule is intended for. But I think a question that kind of came out of that is like, all right, well, now how does that apply, right? How do we actually go about the process of adopting findings that are necessary to kind of make these demonstrations that our code do enable comparative development outcomes? So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time diving into this. I think this would be a great topic for guidance to provide like, hey, here's some sample findings, right? On like how you could apply this in relationship to a given zone or something like that, right? And they can be used either in the compliance pathways, as we've already discussed in the HPS, or in the actual acceleration program, right? When we're choosing courses of action to address an identified barrier. Now, the substance of this demonstration in findings that's done is really around kind of 4 main substantive outcomes. There's 5 subsections in the rule. I'll talk about that 5th one in a second, but it doesn't really require that much in the way of findings. But the 4 substantive ones that we should talk about are around outcomes that relate to the applicable siting standards, the applicable design standards, the applicable procedures, and then, of course, this new addition of category for incentives and bonuses. So for siting, what the rule states is that, the model code has specific ways of regulating siting and regulating building envelope. And when it comes to local land use regulations, hey, that's great. What we're looking for in terms of outcomes is basically a comparable, the same or greater kind of maximum scale intensity or density of actual development, right? We're paying attention to the building envelope. Is it possible to achieve kind of a comparable building envelope under local land use regulations, right? When it comes to design standards, and if I can expand on that point a little bit, I think there was an example brought up in the context of Albany. I'm sorry, I don't intend to pick on it. I just want to use this as an illustrative example. I think there was an example of a zone that was used in the compliance with the CFEC rules, right? So to allow, kind of mixed use development or multi-unit development, higher density multi-unit development. And so what this would be is like, hey, Albany regulates siting differently than what's in the model code. But if you look at the comparable intensity, right, they allow a greater intensity in these particular zones than what would be provided in the model code, which is really around 3-story wood framed apartments, right? And so, that would be the type of finding that you'd include there. Contrast that with, say, that mixed use zone on the riverside that Michael was mentioning that might, maybe allows like 6 units on a 10,000 square foot parcel. Depending on the applicable siting standards that surround that, it might not be as possible to actually hit that same kind of intensity or scale of development. So that's what these findings would actually look like. You'd be writing findings around the actual buildable envelope under the siting standards for that the local government applies. Now, design standards, it is comparable proportional cost. And what does that mean? This rule actually points to another rule in the middle housing piece that provides flexibility on siting and design standards, provided you talk about the costs, right? Like what are the actual costs that are imposed on development by these design standards? And compare that with the public objective that you're actually trying to achieve. What's the public benefit that you're implementing with these design standards? And compare that to the model code. The model code also applies design standards. It focuses a lot on pedestrian design, things like that. Whereas maybe another city wants to focus more on aesthetic, aesthetic beauty or standards related to that, right? And so that's totally fine. The main thing is that the city's considering those different costs that are outlined in that other rule around like labor, land, things like that. And they're comparing that to the public benefits they're trying to achieve and saying, hey, we're shooting for different things in our community, but we think generally that these costs are comparable, right? When we consider these different factors in terms of labor, land, things like that. Procedures, the third one, this one is pretty straightforward. Generally speaking, the model code has procedures around allowing development basically through kind of staff reviewed processes. And the idea here would be that the local processes that are applied here are comparable, right, in terms of kind of the overall timeline and depth of review. And then finally, as mentioned, incentives and bonuses. The idea here was to hone in more specifically on local incentive bonus programs to really enable flexibility around, say, like developing different, bonuses for floor area or density or whatever they are and different flexibilities that might be embedded into local codes. And the idea here is to provide more flexibility, provided they have kind of comparable economic benefits or incentives to achieve affordable or accessible housing. I think a great example of this that is being done, I know Ariel Kane's working on this in the city of Portland, around, say, accessibility bonuses, right? So they're doing kind of analysis related to what accessibility bonuses might work in their specific local context. That's exactly the kind of thing that this would be intended to accommodate. It's like, hey, you've done your own process, you've thought about your local market context, and that would be how you'd frame up this finding. Basically, we've done that process and we think these incentives and bonuses work better. So you'd address those in findings, those different categories, and then that would be reviewed as part of the HPS or acceleration agreement. Now, there is a fifth subsection that is just kind of a general catch-all. That's basically, there aren't other land use regulations that create unreasonable cost or delay to development. Something to know about this wouldn't be apparent unless you understood the case law of unreasonable cost or delay. That has to be tested in court in an as-applied challenge. That's according to case law by LUBA. That's how you test unreasonable cost or delay. So that actually hasn't happened yet in state law. Doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. But basically any city right now would basically say, hey, well, we've never had a standard that's been determined to cause unreasonable cost or delay. But if that ever changes in the future, right, say a successful unreasonable cost or delay challenge happens, well, we certainly wouldn't want to apply that standard to development, right? So that's why that rule's there. So yeah, that's basically the kind of substance of that rule, and that's kind of talking a little bit about what those findings would look like. Of course, I understand we're going to want to get into discussion on that point. However, I want to take a little bit of a minute when we move into discussion to actually break the discussion into two parts. I want to start with everything that's not this. So like if you have feedback or clarification questions around the actual code itself, around other components of the rules, that kind of thing, I actually want to knock that out first, because this part of the discussion is going to take the rest of the time, right? So Deb, I'll pass it back to you to kind of help navigate that discussion with us.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for teeing that up as well. I asked Sean to go ahead and do the presentation all together with the code highlights and the rule highlights. At the risk of making you wait just a little bit longer to dig into the rules in this comparative model code part. But before we get there, questions, clarifications, feedback on the model codes themselves, the code language you're seeing, the small city and then medium large cities, and the content therein, or other things that Sean touched on regarding the codes this morning. Great. Hi, Karen, go ahead.
Hi, I just have a question about whether or not there was a summary document of that engagement that occurred when you did the, the sample code, as well as, the different folks you talked to, so that we could use that as a reference.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we're working on compiling all of that. For the past couple of weeks, we've been working on actually incorporating that feedback into the code, right? That's what me and the consultant team have been doing. But we have been tracking basically all of the feedback that was provided to us through that process. And we're working on getting that into a more comprehensive summary document that we're working on right now, basically.
Not ready yet, but coming soon. Thank you.
Spend time writing the code.
I know. There's been, you got to get the rules out.
Right?
Having their hearing soon. There's a lot on the table here. Alexandra, please go ahead.
I didn't click quite hard enough to unmute myself. Just wanted to say thank you, especially for the model code, especially for smaller jurisdictions where this isn't not necessarily applicable, but it's helpful. I think especially our cities, really, I would say under 5,000, but especially under 2,500 are desperately in need of any help available in terms of planning. Frequently, you're looking at a city recorder, a city manager, maybe you're relying on the county for planning or consultants. So as much clarity and flexibility as possible is incredibly helpful. Our larger and medium cities are still, as best they can, trying to look through the model code and understand how it would interact with their existing codes. I think that's kind of a larger task that is going to take us quite a while, and I probably won't have comment on it that's more precise on the actual text of the code until like right up at the end. And I'm massive sorry for that, but given all the code updates we're already doing, it's one of the harder parts to undertake. I have some concerns around the incentives and bonuses portion. just because I think most of our jurisdictions are extremely resource constrained, so less concerned on the bonuses section and more concerned on like the incentives section, especially with the cuts to like broader state resources and things like that for housing. I think incentives are going to be harder to come by, and it's going to be harder for especially our like medium jurisdictions and even some of our large to structure those incentives. And I see Sean raising his hand and saying they're not mandatory, but like it is.
No, they're land use, I think, is if I
Yeah.
get the words from Sean, not financial incentives.
And that's important to point out, is just that the land use regulations, like when we're talking about the incentive bonus, in particular in 425, where there are two subsections that clarify what that means. The first one is around basically the increased like floor area or density that you'd be able to build, right? That's one component of it. So like how much more house can you build in response, as providing for affordable, accessible housing, things like that. And then the second category is just flexibilities around other land use regulations that basically either decrease costs to development or increase projected revenue from development, right? And just a consideration of those things, it actually does not include financial incentives explicitly in that rule. I don't think there's any reason why a city couldn't optionally consider financial incentives. Like if they wanted to pair this with MUPD, things like that, that would absolutely be something that they could consider, but it's not required in the rule.
That's good,
Just to be
because I
clear.
think there was some consideration for things originally, or I can't remember quite, but always concerned when we're talking about incentives that cities are required to provide. Love a good land use incentive. Also want to make sure that when we're talking about land use incentives, we don't explicitly prohibit financial incentives. So all very happy about that, because financial incentives and land use incentives financial incentives can make the land use incentives work and vice versa. So yeah, that's my actual policy comments on this one.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Brock.
Yeah, a couple things. One, just quickly on the definition of design standard, not opposed to what's in the rule. I would suggest to the department that you make this a two-parted definition for its intersection with Senate Bill 974. I know that's on the 2025-27 Gantt chart for DLCD, but I also know that the timeline for that is currently to be determined. So I would recommend the one that's already in there, or the definition under Section 8, Senate Bill 974 as applicable.
Actually, can I just clarify this, Brock?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's important to point out residential design standards as it's defined in 974 is a subset of a broader set of what design standards are. So like if you look at the definition of residential design standards, it's specifically referring to things that kind of regulate the aesthetics or character or, the overall character of like what the structure looks like. So you're thinking about things like facade, you're thinking about things like, balconies or things that have kind of some aesthetic tie-in or character tie-in around implementation. Whereas design standards as a concept more broadly actually includes a lot of things. For example, open space, common open space for cottage clusters, that's a design standard, right? That's not actually implicated by 974 at all, right? Because it's not connected to the broader aesthetics or character of that implementing provision, right? And it's actually part of the definition of cottage clusters is that they have a common courtyard, right? Now, I think that's very important because that distinction was incorporated into this provision, right? We have design standards, which is a broader subset of things. Then we have a narrower subset of things that are residential design standards as defined in 974. And we actually include, if you look at Chapter 1, a provision implementing that provision in 974. When we're talking about development applications with 20 or more units, we actually had to navigate some statutory ambiguities about the applicability to different housing types because it's not exactly clear in the bill, but we did it. Talking about like when does it actually kick in? What standards are we talking about? That type of thing. So we did include actually implementing that provision, but I think it's important to recognize that specific definition as it relates to standards, implementing that section of that bill. That is a subset of what the overall universe of design standards is. I think that's really important to point out, actually.
Yeah, and that's a good note. I think the one thing that I would note, I'm not sure that the design standards that are listed under the current Division 46 definition includes things like balconies and porches. Not saying that it's not in the model code. The actual development standards aren't as much my area of expertise. I would defer to the builders on that one, but just saying, I think adding it in as a point of clarity would be beneficial. The other
That
piece,
rulemaking is going to have to happen in the future, and they're going to have to reconcile what is the universe of design standards for middle housing, how does that intersect and interrelate with residential design standards, right? And so that's why it points to those rules saying, hey, this is going to happen in the future. They're going to reconcile these terms.
so the other portion, unrelated to design standards, that I want to touch on here, and setting aside potential issues around statutory authority and legislative direction, but in terms of the impacts of the model codes on housing capacity analyses. I do want to note, I appreciate the addition in 410.5E saying that the city doesn't have to update their HCA after applying the model code during that cycle. That is a key add, but it is not sufficient to address the total impact. So to try to put this in really clear context, I went through and I actually did this for a city that has done their BLI, their HCA recently, that is working on their HPS, Malala, right? They've done a really good job with multifamily housing in the last couple years. I think, based on what their analysis was prior to House Bill 2001, they did this in 2022. They have met, and Alexander, please correct me if I'm wrong, roughly half of their multi-unit housing need for the next 20 years over the last 2 years. So one, they are doing a good job in terms of housing production, especially as it relates to typically more affordable housing types. Additionally, they are just over that 10,000 population threshold, and their HPS was recently remanded. In other words, they are more likely to be seeking legal certainty in whatever their next steps are. So I went through and I found their zoning code, R1, R2, and R3. And I went through and I looked at their BLI and put together a table on this. I'm happy to send it over to somebody afterwards. For their R1, they have about 33.25 acres. That's between 4 and 8 dwelling units per acre. That's a zone capacity of 232 units. For their R2, it's about 5 acres, 6 to 12 units per acre. That yields about 35 units. R3, 22.5 acres, 8 to 24 units an acre. That yields 157 units for a total of 425. And this is what was included in their BLI and HCA. Now, because of that addition in 410.5E, if they go in, let's say they were doing all of this right now, they're restarting, right? They apply those model codes, they wouldn't have to account for that capacity in this 8-year production cycle, right? The following production cycle, however, let's assume that they use a portion of this land, they get a little bit additional land, right? And you come out and you have basically the same number of acres in each of those residential zones for the next 8 years, so starting in 2032 or whatever. At that point, right, single family homes are allowed in all 3 of those zones. So the duplex standard at minimum would apply. That gets you to 7.6 units per acre. So for that R1 zone, it takes you from about 232 to 253. It's a difference of 21 units. In my perspective, that's pretty negligible. But when we start getting into the R2 and R3 zones, multifamily housing is allowed there. It's not outright. There are certain conditions, right, for those types of development, but they are allowed in both of those zones. Because of that, when they're doing their second HCA, when that 410.5E no longer applies, because we're looking at a new cycle here, the minimum density in the model code there is 20 units an acre. And because the definition of housing capacity in statute doesn't specify that it's zone capacity, it just says the development capacity, and this can be applied on areas where it exceeds the minimum density of the underlying land zoning, right? That 20 units an acre is what you're going to be using for that next capacity cycle there. So for your R2 and R3 zones, which were previously 35 and 157 units, you now have 101 units and 450 units. So in cycle 2, 804 units is what that capacity would be for the same land, when currently it would be 425. That's an increase of 379 units, which is almost what their need was based on the amount of acres that they had. That's an 89.2% increase in capacity. There is a real problem here.
Can I interrupt for a second? Because this is a capacity and urbanization conversation. This critique applies to actually any upzoning, and it's also not accurate based on how the statute works. You don't base your capacity estimates on the hypothetical maximum zone capacity. You base it on based on the residential zoning designation, based on what the actual development has been over the past X number of years. There is a whole process on the capacity and urbanization side talking about how to do that, how to, characterize capacity, all that kind of stuff in light of like the 3% rule, things like that. That's where that discussion's happening. And this model code and the rules here, we're not dictating how that process plays out. I don't have the expertise to speak to how that conversation's playing out. I'm not in those conversations, right? So I just
would
want to be very
encourage you
clear
and
about
Ethan to
that. Like,
coordinate on that
this is
because
not
when I
unique
talked
to the
Ethan
model
about this
code.
about a month and a half ago. He did
Right.
not
But
indicate
I
that.
want to also be clear. I talked to the urbanization folks, and they're like, yeah, I mean, like the same rules that would apply to any upzoning would apply here. Like that's the thing that makes sense, right? So like provide that feedback to them. Like if you think the model code is somehow unique and different in the context of, it allowing more capacity in a way that a normal upzoning wouldn't, I suggest providing that commentary so that way they can provide, they can respond to it, I don't think it makes sense for these rules to say like, well, model code application is somehow different and is somehow going to not comply with the statute, which dictates how capacity is estimated. So I need to write this rule saying like some weird thing to keep in mind that like makes this more complicated and difficult to use. I don't think that that's the intent
Okay,
here.
but part of the problem here is that the housing capacity analysis, which is a capacity and urbanization topic, is now in Division 8. So that's no longer a Caltech discussion. That's a discussion that gets implicated in this.
Oh, I think we could probably clarify that, Brock, that regardless of what division it's in, there are other elements that are also in Division 8 that are still part of the urbanization conversation. So in order to be able to manage our scopes, this isn't a HOG isn't a division-based scope. It's more of a content and programmatic-based scope. So I know that there's a space to have this conversation, and I know that colleagues are happy to have it. And so if we can just move back to the Housing Actions Work Group scope, I think that would also best honor everyone's time who's prepared to have those discussions here today.
Oh, absolutely. I think
Thank you so
given
much.
that 410 was part of this process, I figured it was close enough, but
Yep.
I will defer.
Thanks, Brock. Mac.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies, I'm gonna have to peel after this comment. I have an 11:30 that I have to hop to. I've been kind of ruminating on this for a little bit and marinating in it. But just kind of reflecting on some of those examples that Michael was given earlier about the maximum number of units allowed in the status quo under existing zoning in some jurisdictions throughout the state. I found that those numbers and the limitations there in those highest density and highest capacity zones to be really wild. My organization, we primarily operate in the Portland Metro, so I haven't delved into some of those communities and their zoning codes outside the Portland Metro in quite some time. But hearing still that current capacity is limiting in those highest capacity zones, potentially 10, 12, not even 20 units on a site in a prime location is inherently disallowing affordable housing. And I say that, and I just want to bring up again, and it's something that I know that I've shared in the space quite a few times, but for an affordable housing project to pencil, it needs about 40 units. And that is because of the economies of scale that is necessary to leverage the low-income housing tax credit program. And that is the program that funds about 95% of affordable housing throughout the country. And so without the ability to have a site in jurisdictions to meet a minimum of 40 units, inherently will push out that ability to use those low-income housing tax credit programs, and it then becomes a limitation of how much funding the state legislature has in that biennium, of that makeup, of that body at that time to fund projects. Whereas if we allow zoning in jurisdictions to have those higher densities, which is towards the direction that the model code is trying to achieve, will help open more affordable housing developments to more communities. And that 40 unit threshold, I also just want to say, is something that like we say right now, but also with increasing construction costs and increasing operating costs, that threshold pushes up, and that's going to push up through time to make sure also that those projects are not only feasible and able to pencil and break down immediately, or not in the near term, but in the long term, that they can also continue to support those operating costs and remain perpetually affordable and in this ecosystem to provide that much needed housing type for communities throughout the state. And so again, I just want to kind of say again the importance of making sure that all jurisdictions throughout the state have land and sites that can accommodate that minimum of 40 units. to make sure that affordable housing and light tech projects are able to pencil in those communities. And that's it. I wish I could stick around longer, but thank you so much.
Matt, before you go, I just want to clarify, you're talking about 40 units nominal number, not 40 units an acre, yes?
40 units nominal, correct.
Yeah. Depending on site, of course, there's land
Yep.
costs for larger sites. Yep, got it. Thank you.
Of course.
Anne.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple things. So I know that we have a maximum floor area ratio in the model code, and I think it's try to crosswalk this where most cities, especially smaller cities, and even in Albany, we're almost 60,000. We use height and lot coverage. We don't have floor area ratios. So in the guidance, you're going to need to help cities. Do we need to adopt these maximum floor area ratios? I mean, I think ours would be more flexible than just, I'm looking at, especially for the larger sites for multi-dwelling units. And then looking at the multi-dwelling unit minimum density, since this is applied to the housing type and not by zone, and it also would include development in mixed-use zones. I mean, I feel like mixed-use buildings and multi-dwelling unit developments and mixed-use buildings, I mean, I feel like this is so restrictive. And also on infill sites, we've got our multi-dwelling unit zones don't have any minimum or maximum. Well, actually, we have minimum densities. We don't have a maximum density. We use height and lot coverage. All of our climate-friendly area zones, same thing. We don't have a maximum or we don't have a maximum density. We don't have a minimum area requirement per unit or anything like that. But I feel like when we're looking at a unit type and not looking at a neighborhood, and we're looking at infill sites, and there's a minimum density of 20 units an acre. I mean, it might be easy to do, using the 6 units on a 10,000 square foot lot, that's 27 units an acre. If it's an infill site in a zone that allows the multi-dwelling unit. But I'm thinking more about applicability in our mixed-use zones and development within mixed-use buildings. It may be easy to achieve the 20 unit, but I hate for us to stifle any residential development in areas where we want to see it, where it might just be the top 1 or 2 floors of a development site. And so I just want to, think carefully about this applicability, not just applying in our residential only zones, but in our climate friendly areas, and that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot. And especially that crosswalk, because I always think of minimum floor area ratio, but we're doing a maximum, and just how we demonstrate that our code is more permissive than the model code, especially most cities don't use floor area ratio outside of metro. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. And just a clarification too on that functionality, and this might be a good time to pivot back to that conversation around the rule 425 that allows, local standards. So that's exactly what that rule accommodates, right? So, right, as mentioned, the large cities model code regulates floor area ratio. And the idea behind 425 is, hey, local governments might not regulate it that way. They might regulate it via, height setbacks, all those types of things. That's great, provided that it has that kind of comparable development outcome, right? It has kind of a comparable scale and intensity of development as would be allowed in the model code, right? So if we're thinking about that buildable envelope, local governments have that flexibility to establish their own local land use regulations that are not the model code, provided they achieve similar development outcomes. So that might be a good time to pivot back to that conversation. Deb, I'll defer to you.
I think that's right. Go ahead, Anne.
We see guidance. I'm sorry. I'm fine with using those terms, but I feel like for the cities that don't use those terms and just say the guidance documents that you guys do a great job with, just make sure that you are crosswalking. Oh, what this means, it could look like this or this. And if you have this, minimum or maximum height and maximum lot coverage, you should be okay, in the conversion. That's all I'm suggesting. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And would be definitely interested in hearing from other jurisdictions as well, if guidance sounds like the right place to help provide that way for cities who don't have FAR, for instance, to show that they're meeting the intent of the model code. All right, so pivoting to the conversation that had started earlier, either that part, Alexandra, hold on, or just sort of this question about, yeah, how to, the comparable pieces that Sean outlined, how cities are going to work through showing comparable code to the model code. Alexandra, go ahead.
I will say a comparable code probably, and this is why I raised my hand in the first place, but on this one, I think comparable code is a big question mark for a lot of our cities because like how do you prove some of these things is like a huge question mark, especially if your code uses a vastly different form to what this is using. It could be as simple as you just don't use floor area ratio, or you could be divergent in multiple aspects, and that's going to cause you more problems in terms of like actual like, okay, so we don't use this, we don't use this, so like how are we proving that? I would say guidance is, I get, a question mark of like whether or not guidance is the right choice, just because to be very candid, guidance doesn't provide legal protections in most cases. And when we talk about rule, that's not really the biggest problem, but it is kind of, as we look at things that may go to LUBA or things like that at later dates, guidance is not necessarily always the most, helpful thing for a city when we're in the end going to have to rely on our city attorneys and things like that if we get into kind of a legal situation with developers. There's a whole other side to that, so I'm not going to dive too deeply into that, but just like planting the flag of like guidance has places, but if it's anything that could put you in a legal dispute, it's probably not the right choice. And yeah, as much flexibility and as much like different ways cities can demonstrate that they are equivalent to the code, especially if they end up in those compliance pathways or things like that, even if like economic data, essentially what your outcomes are, could be a helpful way of doing it. I think, it's just a matter of flexibility on this one for us. But I think there is that big question mark of whether it goes in guidance or rule.
Others have thoughts. Michael, way back, I made you put a pin in a conversation, and now would be a good time to bring that forward if you still have those remaining questions as well.
No, actually, if I said anything, it would be to agree with Brock that we should have the CowTalk conversation. We should be lowering the estimated responses for multifamily zoning. When we're expanding multifamily zoning, they're going to be less productive. That's all to the good. That's an issue, but not for today. I agree.
Okay, thank you. Other musings on whether the rules should be more explicit about how model code comparables are determined, whether guidance is sufficient, if there's certain provisions therein that would be more important to be specific about. Brock, go ahead.
I'll just agree with Alexandra. Having the clarity on how that's going to be compared is going to be really important for cities because they need to determine whether or not they're willing to take on the legal risk of doing that analysis and trying to rebut it, or whether or not they just need to comply with the or whether or not they need to shift to just apply the model code application directly in order to avoid that legal risk.
Yeah, go ahead, Garland.
I just wanted to chime in and follow up on Anne's comment about FARs. I think I've said this previously that we don't really believe that floor area ratio is the right tool to use to regulate middle housing or lower density types of development. It's a great tool for regulating the massing of high rises so you can preserve light and air access, but really to regulate middle housing, lot coverage, height, and tree canopy coverage are much more appropriate tools that don't kind of wield a very sharp axe at development feasibility like FAR can. And so I can submit some more comments on how to pivot away from FAR in the model code, but we don't recommend using FAR to regulate middle housing. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Other feedback on the model code and how the model code can be applied? No? I mean, I'm sure there are, but no more for now. Okay, all right, great. Any last comments or questions from you, Sean, or I'll move us along here.
No, just appreciate the the thoughts and feedback. I think it's worth exploring because like we have the rule and it outlines what those outcomes are. Of course, to provide that flexibility, there's always some discretion that's built into that, right? So to the extent that we can provide additional clarity, either in refinements to the rule or through guidance that happens after rulemaking, we're happy to do that. And of course, encourage the fine-tooth comb that I know you all are going to be taking as you review these new drafts. So just appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And then I'm sorry, you all, I need to check in with staff to make sure we haven't missed anything for the discussion today. I think there was maybe a concern we've missed something, but I'm not sure if we have.
Yeah, we've got one more slide on the acceleration program. Thea, did you want to present that?
Oh, that is a thing. Yeah, I would love to present that. Throw it on up.
We rearranged the agenda and I think some slides got orphaned in the process.
All right, so there really haven't been significant adjustments to this provision since version 1, but do want to remind us all how the compliance pathways end up playing in that acceleration program. And essentially what we've woven in is an opportunity for the DLCD and an obligation for DLCD to review how a city has or has not incorporated those standards that were identified in the HPS program, and identify paths for them to move into sort of compliance with those standards if they find themselves in the acceleration program. So that appears in the audit and sets up the city and DLCD to come to an agreement about how to achieve that in the acceleration agreement. So relatively minor change there, but it does kind of close the loop on that set of actions on those land use sufficiency measures. So I don't think I need to take up more time there, Deb, but happy to entertain questions or thoughts.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you all, we just have a few minutes, but of course Thea's available to chat after or connect with you one-on-one. But in the meantime, are there any questions about acceleration program refinements there? Yeah, Michael.
So in that context, in the context of the new envisioned language on this, which I think I like a step in the right direction, what is the difference between a safe harbor and a rebuttable presumption back in the HPS compliance path? Is there any from the once you're at the audit level?
Once you are in the acceleration program and being audited, those all sort of there's no difference in sort of the prescriptiveness of those HPS actions. So it translates into essentially DLCD will review each of those no matter how prescriptive those actions were in the HPS.
They're all on the table. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, let's draw it to a close there for discussion today. And before we wrap up, I'll have DLCD staff remind you of where sort of more formal comment goes from here. But before we get there, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge this is our last meeting together, sad as that may be. We've been meeting for the last 10 months. And having really fruitful discussions that I see really reflected in the rules and draft products that you've been reviewing today. And obviously there's more work that could or should be done and more ideas you all are bringing to the table. But want to really share my personal appreciation for the work of this group and your grace in getting through this and always showing up prepared and open-minded. And it's been a real joy. I'm going to miss seeing you all. Some of you I've been meeting with for the last 2 years. It'll be a little bit of a shift to not have a weekly meeting on DLCD ONA. So I think I'll recover from it somehow. But wanted to offer the floor for anyone that would like to reflect positively or otherwise on the experience of the HOG and any sort of last comments before we formally adjourn forever. Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, Deb, I also just want to commend you as one of the folks that has been sitting with you in meetings for the last 2 years now. Just appreciate all of your work and herding of cats in these meetings as well. And then also just want to say thank you to staff as well. And I know the governor's office has been engaged and commissioners and everyone and my fellow HOG members. It's this was my first state AC experience across the board, and it's been great in terms of just getting to learn from everyone and see how folks can come from different places and perspectives and motives, but still have respectful dialogue. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for that, and thanks to the team for keeping it that way as well.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for your kind comments and to everyone for your kindness. Anyone else care to share? Yeah, Alan, please.
Thanks, Deb. I also just wanted to, from my role on the Land Conservation and Development Commission, express my really sincere and true appreciation for all the perspectives that folks bring to these work groups, to the rulemaking advisory committees. You know, many of you have been part of this process since the root of the work around ONA in 2019 and in House Bill 2003. So it's been a very, very long road. You know, and for me, you know, that the first rulemaking opportunity for me was follow on from the 2019 rule in 2020. That really led to you know, my opportunity to join the commission in 2022. So I'm a firm believer in the rulemaking process. You know, I think the rulemaking process is a democratic process, and I think that democratic process often means that we compromise in reaching our objectives together. That not everybody is going to get everything that they want here, but we hope that the program can provide what we need to reach those original objectives around balancing the three legs of production, affordability, and choice in the Goal 10 and ONA programming moving forward. You know, it recognizes that we're stronger in this work when we work together. Folks who heard me talk about this work very early on, you know, might have heard or remember the metaphor I used around divorce, those planning processes being divorced from housing and fair housing, and that this was a marriage that brought those things together. You know, I return to that metaphor and say that, you know, as we enter into this marriage, I feel like the honeymoon period is ending, right? That we are getting to a point as we've started to see that this tension, this very hard work will continue, and not just continue to the end of the meeting today, but continue into the next several years, right? My sense is that we need to make sure that we are including the opportunity for iterative revisions as needed in this work. And you know, from a commission perspective, I've heard that from my fellow commissioners, and I think it's something that we're going to need to continue to focus on to make sure that we get it right. But we can't wait to get it right. We need to make sure we get it right down the road. But we're going to continue to move forward, and again, hope that not only has the department, the agency, and the commission fulfilled our roles in the process, but that each of you and the roles that you have in moving this programming forward and solving the housing crisis through that production, affordability, and choice really come to pass as we've all envisioned it, you know, over the last 6 years now. So I'm really grateful for all the time that folks have spent and expertise and perspectives that you brought. And I, in my role, also hope to make sure I carry those to the commissioners that aren't able to spend the time with you all in these meetings. So please do continue to stay engaged, and we look forward to this program moving forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Just getting to the good stuff then. Anyone else? Yeah, Garland, please.
Yeah, I want to echo that I've really appreciated the opportunity to participate in this process. And I just wish that the building codes and the fire codes would also have such an inclusive process to bring them into the 21st century. There's a lot of things in those codes that, now that we focus so much on trying to reduce the barriers to middle housing production in the zoning codes, that's going to be the next set of barriers that developers run against is the building and fire codes. I would love to see such an inclusive process to focus on those rather than some kind of tedious bureaucratic process that's not transparent like this one has been.
Lots of support for that notion, and now you all will have more time to focus on that. Great. Any other closing comments, or I'll hand it over to DLCD staff to wrap us up here. Okay, Thea and Celestina, take it away.
Well, I'll just take a moment and then hand it to Celestina. Really echoing enormous gratitude for all of the work and time you all have put in. This is a really tough volunteer gig. I'll say I am impressed that you all keep showing up, and it's given me a lot of faith and hope in our democratic process. So I really just feel, I feel energized by this, and I'm so glad to have shared this experience with you all, and also just even in those tough spaces, appreciate how you show up in a spirit of collaboration. So again, echoing a lot of sentiments that we've heard before, and also acknowledging, as Vice Chair Lazo said, a successful outcome is coming to a compromise. So there are things, if everybody's a little unhappy, that's probably where we need to be. So on that really positive note, I'll hand it to my colleague Celestina. I'm sure we will see you in this housing space more, and look forward to it.
Thanks, Thea. So much that I could reiterate, but I won't. So thank you all for all of your work. And I think the only thing I could add is that I hope we see you in the work. While the rulemaking is coming to a close, I mean, there are other rulemakings, of course, but even just really focusing on this program, implementation is really a community-wide effort, I would say. Of course, it's our local governments who we're looking to bring the work together in, the housing production strategy work. But there are so many portions of the program that you all have contributed to developing with us that lean on community participation. So to whatever extent you're willing, we'd love to see you in those spaces as across Oregon we continue to roll out this program. And with that, let me just name a few next steps to round out the rulemaking in particular. I think you all have seen at least some of this elsewhere, but just to reiterate, of course, the draft rules are available for comment, and there are some links and email addresses there to continue to use. The public hearing of the Land Conservation and Development Commission is on October 23rd. And I believe I'll be looking for some nods, but that is confirmed for 1 p.m. On the 23rd. Okay, I'm seeing a nod. We've got the public comment period open until November 7th, and then the proposed adoption hearing in early December for the Land Conservation and Development Commission. So just a little recap there. That's not long, less than 2 months away. And we look forward to hearing any additional comments that come in, whether in writing or at the public comment period.
And the RAC is meeting again in a couple of weeks for those of you on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, or those of you who tune in. So that'll be the final meeting of the advisory committees.
A hybrid in-person or virtual option meeting. So those on the RAC, I encourage you to make the trip down to Salem if you're able. I also wanted to just note, in terms of that public hearing in front of LCDC, there is, if you've been on the DLCD website recently, you'll notice some changes just in terms of the commission portion of that website. we've tried to make it abundantly clear and easy for folks to be able to sign up for public testimony. So up on the top, if you click on the commission little drop down, there's like a separate option that's right there for you to sign up to testify. So encourage you all to hope to see folks share their experiences on the rules and the process in front of commission on the 23rd next week.
And if I can add one more thing, just from the HAPO perspective too, knowing that I'm, chiming in there, just one thing to kind of know is that the work doesn't stop there, including on the model codes or anything that we're talking about. There'll be a continuation of refinements around the, principles of housing production, affordability, and choice. Part of that work, and I'll just, include a plug for a process that's already starting to get underway right now for the process improvement studies that are directed under Section 5 of Senate Bill 1537. That will be a process that's underway over the next year that will involve, a lot of engagement, and we'll need the expertise of y'all to help deliver some solid recommendations back to the legislature. So just wanted to put that in there.
Great, thank you. All right, with that, we will draw the hog to a close. Thank you again, much appreciation for your hard work and continued help and implementation in getting more housing in Oregon. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.